What if there was a story that simply reading it would drive you mad? What if this story disguised itself as a simple play, only to lure in new readers to have them succumb to its evil? And what if this story went on to infect other stories around it, eventually changing art, people, and the world as a whole? Well, I'm here to tell you that that story doesn't exist, but for some reason, we keep talking about it. Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about the forbidden fable of the King in Yellow and its consequences across media as we know it. The King in Yellow is a collection of short stories that was published by Robert Chambers in 1895. The through line of the short stories being that of a fictional play called The King in Yellow. Across the short stories in Chambers' book, we see how the King in Yellow is a forbidden mimetic entity that infests the mind of anyone who comes across it. However, you've probably encountered the King in Yellow before, you just didn't know it. Chambers' book went on to inspire a ton of early horror writers, people like H.P. Lovecraft. And the concepts that Chambers mentions in this short story were incredibly ahead of their time in 1895. Things like cognitohazards or mimetic entities or infohazards. So of course, Chambers' writing went on to inspire a ton of media that came after him. But it's not only Chambers' book, The King in Yellow, that has outlived the author himself, but it is the King in Yellow within the King in Yellow that has lived on as well. This unspeakable entity has shown up in dozens of stories over the past several years, all of which reference the same forbidden story that Chambers did all the way back in 1895. So many different pieces of art that I guarantee you've come across before, reference the same monster and story that's never even been told. So why is that? Why is a story that has never existed behind so many of the stories that we know today? And that's what I want to talk about. We're going to talk about the short stories within The King in Yellow, and from there talk about how it's worked its way into so many different pieces of media. And talk about how a creature who is said to infect the mind of artists who encounter it has done the same thing in the real world. A couple of announcements to get out of the way before we begin. For one, I've begun uploading my YouTube videos to Spotify. So if you prefer watching over there, full audio and video copies of everything I post to YouTube will be over there after it's uploaded here. There's been a few unofficial accounts that have uploaded my videos to Spotify, so to clarify, the one that I have linked in the description is the only official Wendigang Spotify channel. So again, if you prefer to watch there, feel free to do so, and I hope you enjoy. The second thing to mention is you are about to get a lot more Wendigang content for, better or worse. And that'll begin a little over a week from now on April the 29th on my other channel, Wendigang. There's a ton of topics that I'll come across that are interesting but just don't fit the bill for a ridiculously long ramble over here on the main channel. So I've taken those topics and put together a team of researchers and writers to help me put together scripts so that I can still cover things I find interesting just in a more concise and shorter format. And again, short for me means less than an hour. We're very excited to show you what we've been working on, and to spoil the first topic, it's about the Kansas City Chiefs fan who dressed as a wolf to all of the Kansas City games and also robbed several banks on his way to those games. Again, that'll be up on Wendigang Tuesday, April the 29th, with hopefully weekly uploads to follow, or at least every other week in the beginning as we still iron out some wrinkles. So be sure you're subscribed over there if you're interested, and thank you all so much for allowing me to go on these weird little projects of mine. It means a lot. Back to our topic for today, if forbidden knowledge and mind parasites that very well might be real sound interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we break down the horrors of the King in Yellow. And another piece of forbidden knowledge is food that's good for you, delicious, easy to make, and won't break the bank. Or at least it was before today's sponsor, Factor. Factor makes meeting your nutritional goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals straight to your door. Factor's delicious meals can be ready in as little as 2 minutes. Each weekly menu has 35 options, including popular categories like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or vegan and veggie options. There's also a bunch of add-ons you can get every week, like breakfast or on-the-go lunch or snacks and beverages to help you stay fueled and feel good all day long. Factor also takes the stress out of meal planning and prep, as Factor is cheaper, tastes better, and is better for you than takeout, and is just as easy to make, as Factor's meals are simply heat and eat. Factor is also super flexible. Every week, you can get 4 to 18 meals per week, or pause or reschedule your deliveries at any time. Factor would send me boxes for these ads, but I had to get more in addition because my wife would keep stealing the boxes from me before I had a chance to actually film the B-roll with them. They're not only delicious, but save a ton of time and headache. So if you want to get in on this incredible offer, then head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50Wendigoon to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50Wendigoon at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box today. Thank you all for watching the ad, and thank you to Factor for sponsoring the channel. Their link is in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So to clarify, The King in Yellow is both the name of Chambers' book as well as the fictional story within the book. And we do get some small excerpts from this lost story. As a matter of fact, The King in Yellow opens with a passage from the fictional King in Yellow, a passage known as Casilda's Song. Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink behind the lake, the shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa. Songs that the high age shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung as tears unshed, shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. We will see other excerpts from this fictional story as well, but this is by far the longest. Immediately, this sounds like we're on some kind of alien planet. We have mentions of twin suns and black stars and strange moons. And wherever this Carcosa is, it seems to be the home of the king, or at least the tatters of the king. A lot of the language used sounds very apocalyptic. Mentions of my voice being dead, and tears are unshed, and they shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. It seems that whatever Carcosa was, it is something that is now past. Also, we have the title of this poem itself, Casilda's Song. Who was Casilda? Was she a resident of Carcosa or just someone who's heard about it like us? We'll get more of an idea around Carcosa and the King in Yellow as we dive into some of Chambers' stories. As mentioned in the intro, the King in Yellow is an anthology, with the through line of the stories in the anthology, or at least the first 4, being this fictional play, The King in Yellow. If any of this is confusing, I swear it'll be cleared up with our first short story. So let's go ahead and get into it. Our first story is called The Repairer of Reputations, and it opens with a quote from a French book, the title of which I'll show on screen now. Translated, the quote reads, "Do not mock the fools. Their madness lasts longer than ours. That is the only difference." So a quote saying that the only difference between us and those that we consider insane is that their insanity just sticks around. Something to keep in mind as we read this story. The Repairer of Reputations takes place in 1920s New York. And since Chambers published this book in 1895, he is describing a world a few decades into the future. In setting up this future United States, our protagonist, who we'll meet in a minute, describes the setting. He says that there was a President Winthrop. He says that Cuba, Hawaii, and Samoa were bought by the United States, which is a pretty good guess. And the craziest thing he gets right is when he says on the first page, the war with Germany, incident on that country's seizure of the Samoan Islands, had left no visible scars upon the Republic. So other than the seizure of the Samoan Islands part, he was right that in 1920 we would just be getting out of a war with Germany. And initially, everything seems to be great in this new future. They describe how old architecture was being destroyed, and these beautiful new structures and bridges and parks throughout cities had made living there so much better. However, the first cracks of this futuristic world show up on the second page. We had profited well by the latest treaties with France and England. The exclusion of foreign-born Jews as a measure of self-preservation. The settlement of the new independent black state of Swanee, the checking of immigration, the new laws concerning naturalization, and the gradual centralization of power in the executive all contributed to national calm and prosperity. When the government solved the Indian problem and squadrons of Indian cavalry scouts in native costume were substituted for the pitiable organizations tacked on to the tail of skeletonized regiments by a former Secretary of War, the nation drew a long sigh of relief. When, after the colossal congress of religions, bigotry, and intolerance were laid in their graves, and kindness and charity began to draw warring sects together, many thought the millennium had arrived, at least in the New World, which after all is a world by itself. So while you could just read that as, this book was written in the 1890s, maybe that level of isolation was just Chambers' idea of an idealized world. But I don't think so, for one, because of what else we find out about this world in the next paragraph, but two, because Chambers specifically mentions that this new world is one without bigotry or intolerance, which it seems purposeful to place that sentence right after the sentence that said everyone who wasn't the same ethnicity or shared the same ideas was kicked out. The world seems to be resting on a kind of hypocrisy, one that becomes apparent on the next page. In the city of New York, the summer of 1899 was signalized by the dismantling of the elevated railroads. The summer of 1900 will live in the memories of New York people for many a cycle. The Dodge statue was removed in that year. In the following winter began that agitation for the repeal of the laws prohibiting suicide, which bore its final fruit in the month of April, 1920, when the first government lethal chamber was opened on Washington Square. So all that mention of this perfect futuristic New York City, and then the mention that the government has installed a lethal chamber. What is a lethal chamber, you may ask? It is exactly what you think it is, a chamber that you walk in and die. It's from here that our protagonist begins to talk about himself. Our protagonist is a man named Hildred Castaigne. And in the first few paragraphs that Hildred talks about himself, we get a lot of information not only about him, but about this king in yellow. I had walked down that day from Dr. Archer's house on Madison Avenue, where I had been as a mere formality. Ever since that fall from my horse, 4 years before, I had been troubled at times with pains in the back of my head and neck, but now for months they had been absent, and the doctor sent me away that day saying there was nothing more to be cured in me. It was hardly worth his fee to be told that, I knew it myself. Still, I did not grudge him the money. What I minded was the mistake which he made at first. When they picked me up from that pavement where I lay unconscious, and somebody had mercifully sent a bullet through my horse's head, I was carried to Dr. Archer, and he, pronouncing my brain affected, placed me in his private asylum where I was obliged to endure treatment for insanity. At last he decided that I was well, and I, knowing that my mind had always been as sound as his, if not sounder, paid my tuition, as he jokingly called it, and left. I told him, smiling, that I would get even with him for his mistake, and he laughed heartily and asked me to call once in a while. I did so, hoping for a chance to even up accounts, but he gave me none, and I told him I would wait. So 4 years ago, Hildred fell from his horse in an accident that was bad enough that the horse had to be put down. And according to Hildred, he was always of a sound mind, but regardless, this evil Dr. Archer committed him to an asylum. And Hildred says that he is hoping to even accounts with Dr. Archer, whatever that means. While Hildred frames it as a good thing, he does admit that the fall did change him. As right after this, he says, "The fall from my horse had fortunately left no evil results. On the contrary, it had changed my whole character for the better. From the lazy young man about town, I had become active, energetic, temperate, and above all else, ambitious. There was only one thing which troubled me. I laughed at my own uneasiness, and yet it troubled me." So according to Hildred, this accident was a good thing. But what is it that troubled him? Well, here we get our first mention in this story of the King in Yellow. "During my convalescence, I had bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred gate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it. But as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read it and reread it, and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me." So while committed to an asylum, Hildred read The King in Yellow. And although he says the first act didn't have an effect on him, he was still compelled to throw it into the fireplace. But as soon as he saw the opening words of the second act, he was transfixed. Think about it. He just saw a few words in the second act, and from there began crying and dragged the book to his bedroom. And then we know after his asylum stay that he completely changed as a person. Again, for the better according to him, as far as we know now. As far as his description of this book, The King in Yellow itself, or the play that is, again, to clarify, The King in Yellow is both Chambers' book, the fictional play / book in the story and the character within the fictional play / book in the real book. So when describing this play, this is all that Hildred says. This is the thing that troubles me. For I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, when the twin suns sink into the lake of Hali, and my mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed the world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth, a world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. So we see some similarities between what Hildred is describing and Casilda's song mentioned in the opening. The twin suns, Lake of Hali. We get a mention of something called the Pallid Mask, which will be a recurring theme throughout some of the stories, or in other words, a pale mask. Many interpret the Pallid Mask as what the King in Yellow himself wears, but again, that's up for interpretation. Again, we get glimpses of this fictional story, but we never actually see it, just the effect it has on people who do see it. And it seems that Hildred isn't the only one who has had a profound effect because of this story. When the French government seized the translated copies which had just arrived in Paris, London, of course, became eager to read it. It is well known how the book spread like an infectious disease from city to city, from continent to continent, barred out here, confiscated there, denounced by press and pulpit, censored even by the most advanced of literary anarchists. No definite principles had been violated in those wicked pages, no doctrine promulgated, no convictions outraged. It cannot be judged by any known standard yet, although it was acknowledged that the supreme note of art had been struck in The King in Yellow, all felt that human nature could not bear the strain, nor thrive on words in which the essence of purest poison lurked. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterward with more awful effect. So the entire world has developed a stigma around this book. Even though no one can say explicitly what is wrong with it, everything from churches to news sources are saying it shouldn't be touched. There's translations being made in France that are confiscated by the police because the book is banned there. According to Hildred, everyone admits that it is supreme art, but they also all say that no one should touch it. So perhaps the book is just floating around in secretive circles. Perhaps it's coming into people's hands, like Hildred when he just so happened to buy it while he was in an asylum. And while it seems that the book has been widely banned, there are effects in this world that seem to come from the book itself. As mentioned earlier, we have a society that says it's free of bigotry and intolerance after it got rid of everyone they don't want to tolerate. And the most striking insanity is that of the lethal chamber. Hildred says that the lethal chamber was built in Washington Square, and in front of the lethal chamber is a beautiful garden surrounded by restaurants and cafes. He says that the chamber itself has 6 ionic columns and a massive bronze door. He also says a splendid marble group of the Fates stood before the door, the work of a young American sculptor, Boris Yvain, who had died in Paris when only 23 years old. Keep that in mind for a later story. As Hildred is walking through the square, there's an inauguration ceremony for the lethal chamber. At this inauguration are several government officials, including the governor, who is giving a speech as Hildred passes. The governor was finishing his reply to the short speech of the Surgeon General. I heard him say, "The laws prohibiting suicide and providing punishment for any attempt at self-destruction have been repealed. The government has seen fit to acknowledge the right of man to end an existence which may have become intolerable to him through physical suffering or mental despair. It is believed that the community will be benefited by the removal of such people from their midst. Since the passage of this law, the number of suicides in the United States has not increased. Now the government has determined to establish a lethal chamber in every city, town, and village in the country. It remains to be seen whether or not that class of human creatures, from whose desponding ranks new victims of self-destruction fall daily, will accept the relief thus provided." He paused and turned to the white lethal chamber. The silence in the street was absolute. "There a painless death awaits him who can no longer bear the sorrows of this life. If death is welcome, let him seek it there." Then quickly, turning to the military aide of the president's household, he said, "I declare the lethal chamber open." And again facing the vast crowd, he cried in a clear voice, "Citizens of New York and of the United States of America, through me, the government declares the lethal chamber to be open. Again, we have the removal of the unwanted framed as a good thing. The governor even said it is believed that the community will be benefited by the removal of such people from their midst. Now, there's two ways to look at this. For one, it can just be the general madness of the world around Hildred on display. If the King in Yellow is affecting society to a great degree, then that explains why it gets to a place where the government builds these beautiful structures and proclaims its own opulence. And if you don't like it, please see yourself out. The other way to see it is that maybe people are going so mad from reading The King in Yellow that society has nothing else it can do with them. Maybe it's not the government and powers that be that are infected by the madness of The King in Yellow. Maybe it's just that people who are affected are such a problem that the government felt it right to build lethal chambers. It's also never explained what's actually inside of a lethal chamber or, how it kills you. My running theory is it's like the giant gray brick things in Mario, with the big spikes in the face on them. Like you walk into the lethal chamber and it's quiet for a minute, and then just like a 40-ton boulder smashes you, and then it just resets for the next guy that walks in. I guess it could also be like a gun or something, but I like my version better. After this, Hildred Castaigne goes to an armorer's shop ran by a man named Hawberg. When Hildred walks into the shop, Hawberg says, "Come in, Mr. Castaigne," and quickly, Hawberg's daughter, Constance, stands up and turns the corner to greet him, only to be disappointed when she sees that it's Hildred. Hildred explains to us that this is because Constance is in love with Hildred's cousin, Louis Castaigne, and Louis is currently on a deployment with the military, but is due to be home soon. Hildred says he loves to be in the armorer's shop to hear the clinking of metal and see the restoration and creation of pieces of armor. Despite this, however, he says he doesn't care for Hawberg or his daughter Constance. As a matter of fact, he says on page 6, "I love to hear the music of steel brushing against steel, the mellow shock of the mallet on thigh pieces, and the jingle of chain armor. That was the only reason I went to see Hawberg. He had never interested me personally, nor did Constance, except for the fact of her being in love with Louis. This did occupy my attention, and sometimes even kept me awake at night. But I knew in my heart that all would come right, and that I should arrange their future as I expected to arrange that of my kind doctor, John Archer." What? For some reason, Louis and Constance being in love with each other bothers Hildred a lot, and he says he's going to arrange their future in the same way he plans to arrange the future for Dr. Archer, which is probably not a good thing. After small talk, Hildred tells us that the real reason he's there is to see the man who lives above the armorer's shop, a man named Mr. Wilde. When Hildred begins to make his way upstairs, the following conversation takes place. "Are you going upstairs to see the lunatic again?" laughed old Hawberg. If Hawberg knew how I loathe the word lunatic, he would never use it in my presence. It rouses certain feelings within me which I do not care to explain. However, I answered him quietly. "I think I shall drop in and see Mr. Wilde for a moment or two." "Poor fellow," said Constance with a shake of the head. "It must be hard to live alone year after year, poor, crippled, and almost demented. It is very good of you, Mr. Castaigne, to visit him as often as you do." "I think he is vicious," observed Hawberg, beginning again with his hammer. I listened to the golden tinkle on the greave plates. When he had finished, I replied, "No, he is not vicious, nor is he in the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber, from which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our life to acquire." Hawberg laughed. I continued a little impatiently. "He knows history as no one else could know it. Nothing, however trivial, escapes his search, and his memory is so absolute, so precise in details, that were it known in New York that such a man existed, the people could not honor him enough." "Nonsense," muttered Hawberg, searching on the floor for a fallen rivet. "Is it nonsense?" I asked, managing to suppress what I felt. "Is it nonsense when he says that the tassets and cuissards of the enameled suit of armor commonly known as the Prince's Emblazoned can be found among a mass of rusty theatrical properties, broken stoves, and rag pickers' refuse in a garret in Pell Street?" Hawberg's hammer fell to the ground, but he picked it up and asked, with a great deal of calm, how I knew that the tassets and left cuissard were missing from the Prince's Emblazoned. "I did not know until Mr. Wilde mentioned it to me the other day. He said that they were in the garret of 998 Pell Street." "Nonsense," he cried, but I noticed his hand trembling under his leather apron. Is this nonsense too? I asked pleasantly. Is it nonsense when Mr. Wilde continually speaks of you as the Marquise of Avonshire, and of Miss Constance? I did not finish, for Constance had started to her feet with terror written on every feature. Hawberk looked at me and slowly smoothed his leather apron. That is impossible, he observed. Mr. Wilde may know a great many things. About armor, for instance, and the prince emblazoned, I interposed, smiling. Yes, he continued slowly. About armor also, maybe, but he is wrong in regard to the Marquise of Avonshire, who, as you know, killed his wife's traducer years ago and went to Australia where he did not long survive his wife. Mr. Wilde is wrong, murmured Constance. Her lips were blanched, but her voice was sweet and calm. Let us agree, if you please, that in this one circumstance, Mr. Wilde is wrong, I said. So, a lot of context there. Whoever this Mr. Wilde is upstairs, Constance and Hawberk think that he's mad. This angers Hildred, who can barely suppress his rage, not only at the mention of Mr. Wilde being mad, but just at the mention of words like lunatic. And maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle between him being an all-knowing sage and a madman. Because according to Hawberk, Mr. Wilde is right that this piece of armor does have some missing components. And we're going to find out later in the story that Mr. Wilde was right about those missing pieces being exactly where Wilde said they'd be. But then Wilde also accused Hawberk of being a guy who murdered his wife's partner and then died in Australia. And that is never brought up again. So I guess we're to assume that's right. That Hawberk killed the man who was sleeping with his wife and then changed his name. Regardless, Hawberk and Constance seem to think that Mr. Wilde is mad, and Hildred gets really upset at that idea. So Hildred goes upstairs and opens a door at the end of the hallway, and Mr. Wilde lets him in. And at our first description of Mr. Wilde, we can probably see why other people have the opinion of him that they do. When it says on page 10, when he had double locked the door and pushed a heavy chest against it, he came and sat down beside me, peering up into my face with his little light-colored eyes. Half a dozen new scratches covered his nose and cheeks, and the silver wires which supported his artificial ears had become displaced. I thought I had never seen him so hideously fascinating. He had no ears. The artificial ones, which now stood out at an angle from the fine wire, were his one weakness. They were made of wax and painted a shell pink, but the rest of his face was yellow. He might better have reveled in the luxury of some artificial fingers for his left hand, which was absolutely fingerless, but it seemed to cause him no inconvenience, and he was satisfied with his wax ears. So the dude is yellow. He's later described as like a sickly appearance. So I imagine yellow like seasick or like jaundiced yellow. And he has no ears. He has fake ones that are held on by silver wire. He has no fingers. Just like, I guess, nubs for hands. And then he goes on to say he was very small, scarcely higher than a child of 10, but his arms were magnificently developed and his thighs as thick as any athlete's. Still, the most remarkable thing about Mr. Wilde was that a man of his marvelous intelligence and knowledge should have such a head. It was flat and pointed, like the heads of many of those unfortunates whom people imprison in asylums for the weak-minded. Many called him insane, but I knew him to be as sane as I was. That line hits so much harder on a second read. So he lives in the top room above this armor's building, and he's described as like a goblin. But it gets even weirder because then he says, I do not deny that he was eccentric. The mania he had for keeping that cat and teasing her until she flew at his face like a demon was certainly eccentric. He then, in describing a fight he witnessed between Mr. Wilde and the cat, said that one time, before I could move, she flattened her belly to the ground, crouched, trembled, and sprang into his face. Howling and foaming, they rolled over and over on the floor, scratching and clawing until the cat screamed and fled under the cabinet, and Mr. Wilde turned over on his back, his limbs contracting and curling up like the legs of a dying spider. So this dude just lives in this upper loft in New York City, has a cat that almost kills him constantly. And I guess that's why he doesn't have ears or fingers. The cat took him at some point. We then get a description of what Mr. Wilde does and find out that he is the character whom the story is named after, the repairer of reputations. Because apparently, Mr. Wilde has a business repairing the reputations of people who had had their reputation damaged. According to him, people send letters and money to seek out his service. In an example he gives, he says, P. Green Dusenberry, minister of the gospel, Fair Beach, New Jersey. Reputation damaged in the Bowery. To be repaired as soon as possible. Retainer $100. So Mr. Wilde apparently sets about making these people have a higher standing in the community, and he later goes on to say that he has 500 men in his employ, and he describes these retainers as being $100 to $500 at a time. So if a dude who has 500 employees and is making that much money in 1890s money, then what is he doing in a rundown apartment above an armorer's shack with a cat that tries to kill him? He later says that everyone from high-profile businessmen to politicians seek out his service. Or at least, that's what he tells Hildred. While Hildred and Mr. Wilde are talking, someone knocks on the door before Mr. Wilde sends him away. When Hildred asks who that was, Mr. Wilde says that it is Arnold Stylet, owner and editor-in-chief of the Great New York Daily, which would be quite impressive if that guy was coming to Mr. Wilde, but again, Hildred never actually saw him, just someone on the other side of a door. Hildred then asks Mr. Wilde, where are the notes? And Mr. Wilde hands him a copy of the Imperial Dynasty of America. From there, Hildred says this, one by one, I studied the well-worn pages, worn only by my own handling, and although I knew all by heart from the beginning, when from Carcosa, the Hyades, Hastur, and Aldebaran, to Castaigne, Louis de Calvados, born December 19th, 1877. I read it with an eager, rapt attention, pausing to repeat parts of it aloud, and dwelling especially on Hildred de Calvados, only son of Hildred Castaigne and Edith Landis Castaigne, first in succession, etc., etc. When I finished, Mr. Wilde nodded and coughed. Speaking of your legitimate ambition, he said, how do Constance and Louis get along? She loves him, I replied simply. The cat on his knee suddenly turned and struck at his eyes, and he flung her off and climbed onto the chair opposite me. And Dr. Archer, but that's a matter you can settle any time you wish, he added. Yes, I replied. Dr. Archer can wait, but it is time I saw my cousin Louis. It is time, he repeated. Then he took another ledger from the table and ran over the leaves rapidly. We are now in communication with 10,000 men, he muttered. We can count on 100,000 within the first 28 hours, and in 48 hours, the state will rise in mass. The country follows the state, and the portion that will not, California and the Northwest, might better never have been inhabited. I shall not send them the yellow sign. The blood rushed to my head, but I only answered, a new broom sweeps clean. The ambition of Caesar and of Napoleon pales before that which could not rest until it had seized the minds of men and controlled even their unborn thoughts, said Mr. Wilde. You are speaking of the king in yellow, I groaned with a shudder. He is a king who emperors have served. I am content to serve him, I replied. Mr. Wilde sat rubbing his ears with his crippled hand. Perhaps Constance does not love him, he suggested. Okay, so piece by piece. First of all, this Imperial Dynasty of America seems to be a sort of plan. Initially, we get mentions to things related to Casilda's song, or the fictional King in Yellow, mentions of Carcosa and Hyades and Hastur. But because this is a sort of game plan or prophecy, it has mentions of the future, as it mentions Hildred's son, who is to be Hildred de Calvados, after Hildred Castaigne has a child with Edith Landis Castaigne, whoever that might be. But it seems that Hildred's cousin Louis has some piece in this plan as well. Not only is his name and date of birth mentioned in the Imperial Dynasty of America, but as soon as Hildred gets done reading the Imperial Dynasty of America, that's when Mr. Wilde asks, how do Constance and Louis get along? And he also says that Hildred can settle his deal with Dr. Archer whenever he wants. It can be assumed, given the title of these notes, that the Imperial Dynasty details a sort of coup that is to take place, and that this coup specifically is for the King in Yellow. A concept and ambition that is greater in mind than Caesar and Napoleon, as Mr. Wilde says. And according to Mr. Wilde, as a part of this coup, he's in communication with 10,000 men who are going to start, I guess, grassroots movements in order to help the coup take effect. And that areas that will not go in line with this coup will not be sent the yellow sign. But whatever this plan is, again, Louis and Constance's romance has some effect on it. The two are cut off by the sound of music from a parade on the street below. Hildred looks out the window to see that Louis's regiment has arrived back from their deployment. Mr. Wilde remarks that Hildred needs to talk to Louis, and Hildred leaves to go back to his home. It's after Hildred gets home on page 14 that we get this interesting description. Here I lunched comfortably, read the Herald and the Meteor, and finally went to the steel safe in my bedroom and set the time combination. The 3 3/4 minutes which it is necessary to wait while the time lock is opening are to me golden moments. From the instant I set the combination to the moment when I grasp the knobs and swing back the solid steel doors, I live in an ecstasy of expectation. Those moments must be like moments passed in paradise. I know what I am to find at the end of the time limit. I know what the massive safe holds secure for me alone, and the exquisite pleasure of waiting is hardly enhanced when the safe opens and I lift from its velvet crown a diadem of purest gold, blazing with diamonds. I do this every day, and yet the joy of waiting and at last touching again the diadem only seems to increase as the days pass. It is a diadem fit for a king among kings, an emperor among emperors. The king in yellow might scorn it, but it shall be worn by his royal servant. I held it in my arms until the alarm in the safe rang harshly, and then tenderly, proudly, I replaced it and shut the steel doors. So every day Hildred goes to this safe and gets out a diadem, or effectively a crown, puts it on his head, enjoys the ecstasy of it, as you heard, and then puts it back in the safe. Again, we're getting clues of a coup, we're getting clues of some grand plan, and we're getting Hildred's obsession with wearing a crown. After this, Hildred goes and looks out the window of his apartment, and from his apartment window, he can see the lethal chamber at Washington Square. And it's here that it seems the lethal chamber has its first customer. As I was turning carelessly away, a slight commotion in the group of curious loiterers around the gates attracted my attention. A young man had entered and was advancing with nervous strides along the gravel path which leads to the bronze doors of the lethal chamber. He paused a moment before the fates, and as he raised his head to those 3 mysterious faces, the pigeon rose from its sculptured perch, circled about for a moment, and wheeled to the east. The young man pressed his hand to his face, and then with an undefinable gesture sprang up the marble steps. The bronze doors closed behind him, and half an hour later the loiterers slouched away. The frightened pigeon returned to its perch in the arms of fate. So again, we don't know exactly what happens in the lethal chamber, but we know that people go in there to die. I like this little moment right after we see Hildred's madness of putting the crown on his head and feeling the ecstasy of it. We see another example of the madness of the King in Yellow as someone makes their way into the lethal chamber. After this, Hildred goes to see his cousin Louis, and we're immediately shown how different the two men are. As I crossed the central driveway, a group of officers passed, and one of them called out, "Hello, Hildred," and came back to shake hands with me. It was my cousin Louis, who stood smiling and tapping his spurred heels with his riding whip. "Just back from Westchester," he said. "Been doing the bucolic, milk and curds, and, you know, dairymaids and sunbonnets who say, 'aw,' and 'I don't think,' when you tell them they're pretty. I'm nearly dead for a square meal at Delmonico's. What's the news?" "There is none," I replied pleasantly. "I saw your regiment coming in this morning." "Did you? I didn't see you. Where were you?" "In Mr. Wilde's window." "Oh, hell," he began impatiently. "That man is stark mad. I don't understand why you—" He saw how annoyed I felt by this outburst and begged my pardon. "Really, old chap," he said, "I don't mean to run down a man you like, but for the life of me I can't see what the deuce you find in common with Mr. Wilde. He's not well bred, to put it generously. He is hideously deformed. His head is the head of a criminally insane person. You know yourself he's been in an asylum." "So have I interrupted calmly. Louis looked startled and confused for a moment, but recovered and slapped me heartily on the shoulder. "You were completely cured," he began, but I stopped him again. I suppose you mean that I was simply acknowledged never to have been insane. Of course, that's what I meant, he laughed. I disliked his laugh because I knew it was forced, but I nodded gaily and asked him where he was going. So it seems that Lewis also has problems with Mr. Wilde, but he likes his cousin Hildred and doesn't want to offend him. Hildred, as you can tell, is very offended. We also get some context that Mr. Wilde had also been in an asylum at some point, and there's a little bit of uneasiness when Hildred says that he was found to have never been insane, and Lewis is like, yeah, that's what I meant, implying that maybe Lewis is more privy to Hildred's mental condition than Hildred is. But again, Lewis doesn't want to offend his cousin, so he just goes along with it. Lewis says that he really wants to see Constance, so him and Hildred should go over to Hawberk's shop, and then the four of them can go out for a walk. When they arrive at Hawberk's shop, Lewis and Constance immediately begin doting over each other, and Hildred initially says that he wants to leave before deciding that it's probably best if he keeps an eye on the two. Again, the two of them have some greater effect on his grand scheme. Again, because this is a slightly futuristic New York, it says that in this timeline, they built these big terraces throughout the city that allow for these beautiful walks at sunset, elevated above the ground level of New York City. So as the four of them are walking on this terrace, Lewis is talking about his time in the military and explaining some of the things in the military. And at some point, Lewis and Constance go off for a walk on their own, leaving Hawberk and Hilbert alone. Hawberk tells Hilbert that he went to the location Mr. Wilde said the armor would be at, and sure enough, it was there. At this, Hilbert says, "Mr. Wilde is a very intelligent man," I observed. "I want to give him the credit of this most important discovery," continued Hawberk, "and I intend it shall be known that he is entitled to the fame of it." "He won't thank you for that," I answered sharply. "Please, say nothing about it." "Do you know what it is worth?" said Hawberk. "No, $50 perhaps." "It is valued at 500, but the owner of the Prince's Emblazoned will give $2,000 to the person who completes his suit. That reward also belongs to Mr. Wilde." "He doesn't want it. He refuses it," I answered angrily. "What do you know about Mr. Wilde? He doesn't need the money. He is rich, or will be richer than any living man except myself. What will we care for money then? What will we care, he and I, when what?" demanded Hawberk, astonished. "You will see," I replied, on my guard again. He looked at me narrowly, much as Dr. Archer used to, and I knew he thought I was mentally unsound. Perhaps it was fortunate for him that he did not use the word lunatic just then. "No," I replied to his unspoken thought. "I am not mentally weak. My mind is as healthy as Mr. Wilde's. I do not care to explain just yet what I have on hand, but it is an investment which will pay more than mere gold, silver, and precious stones. It will secure the happiness and prosperity of a continent. Yes, a hemisphere." "Oh," said Hawberk. "And eventually," I continued more quietly, "it will secure the happiness of the world. And incidentally, your own happiness and prosperity as well as Mr. Wilde's?" "Exactly." I smiled, but I could have throttled him for taking that tone. He looked at me in silence for a while, and then said very gently, "Why don't you give up your books and studies, Mr. Castaigne, and take a tramp among the mountains somewhere or other? You used to be fond of fishing. Take a cast or two at the trout in the Ranglies." "I don't care for fishing anymore," I answered without a shade of annoyance in my voice. "You used to be fond of everything," he continued. "Athletics, yachting, shooting, riding." "I have never cared to ride since my fall," I said quietly. "Ah, yes, your fall," he repeated, looking away from me. Something I really like about Chambers' stories, and this is prevalent through a lot of the stories in this anthology, is how much character he can give, like side characters, with just a few lines of dialogue. Because think about it this way: Hawberk, Constance, Lewis, Hildred, they've all known each other for years, assumedly. And given Lewis's line earlier where he says, "Oh, well, you were declared sane. I mean, were never insane in the first place." It seems that the people around Hildred knew that there was probably something wrong with him, and there was probably a reason he got committed to an asylum. And now everyone around Hildred seems suspicious of Mr. Wilde and why Hildred is spending so much time with him. And there is so much unsaid in the line when Hauberk says, and incidentally your own happiness and prosperity as well as Mr. Wilde's, indicating that Hauberk suspects that Mr. Wilde is manipulating Hilbert to a degree. And in spite of this, Hauberk was still willing to give Mr. Wilde the money and notoriety for the piece of armor that Mr. Wilde helped him locate. We also get a bit more of Hildred's hypocrisy. Earlier he said that after his fall he went from quiet and timid to outgoing and ambitious. But here we have mentioned that he doesn't really do anything anymore. He used to be into athletics, yachting, shooting, and riding, but now he just talks to Mr. Wilde. We also get a bit more of a look at what this plan is, what the Imperial Dynasty of America might be. As Hildred says soon, him and Mr. Wilde won't need money, as Mr. Wilde will be the second richest person in the world next to Hildred, and that this plan will eventually bring happiness to the entire world. We also see more signs of Hildred's anger coming through, and it's pretty apparent that Hauberk cares about Hildred, but in spite of that, Hildred says it's good Hauberk didn't choose to say the word lunatic, and says he could have choked him for Hauberk using a certain tone of voice. After this interaction, Hilbert says, I thought this nonsense had gone far enough, so I brought the conversation back to Mr. Wilde, but he was scanning my face again in a manner highly offensive to me. Mr. Wilde, he repeated, do you know what he did this afternoon? He came downstairs and nailed a sign over the hall door next to mine. It read, Mr. Wilde, repairer of reputations, third bell. Do you know what a repairer of reputations can be? I do, I replied, suppressing the rage within. Oh, he said again. For one, this is more pointing out that Mr. Wilde is not actually a repairer of reputations or isn't as prolific as he claims to be, because again, a guy with 5,000 men or 500 men in his employ who is doing work for like politicians and businessmen wouldn't just now be putting a sign up. But again, even a snide remark at Mr. Wilde's occupation makes Hildred angry. Constance and Lewis walk back and the four of them begin to walk away. But after hearing Lewis and Constance sweet talk each other, Hildred remarks that it was time that he should speak of important matters with his cousin. We then skip forward some days or weeks as Hildred is once again standing in his apartment wearing the crown. One morning early in May, I stood before the steel safe in my bedroom, trying on the golden jeweled crown. The diamonds flashed fire as I turned to the mirror, and the heavy beaten gold burned like a halo about my head. I remembered Camilla's agonized scream and the awful words echoing through the dim streets of Carcosa. They were the last lines in the first act, and I dared not think of what followed. Dared not, even in the spring sunshine, there in my own room, surrounded with familiar objects, reassured by the bustle from the street and the voices of the servants in the hallway outside. For those poisoned words had dropped slowly into my heart, as death sweat drops upon a bedsheet and is absorbed. Trembling, I put the diadem from my head and wiped my forehead, but I thought of Hastur and of my own rightful ambition, and I remembered Mr. Wilde as I had last left him, his face all torn and bloody from the claws of that devil's creature, and what he said. Ah, what he said. The alarm bell in the safe began to whir harshly, and I knew my time was up, but I would not heed it, and replacing the flashing circlet upon my head, I turned defiantly to the mirror. I stood for a long time absorbed in the changing expression of my own eyes. The mirror reflected a face which was like my own, but wider, and so thin that I hardly recognized it. All the time I kept repeating between my clenched teeth, "The day has come! The day has come!" While the alarm in the safe whirred and clamored and the diamonds sparkled and flamed above my brow, I heard a door open but did not heed it. It was only when I saw two faces in the mirror. It was only when another face rose over my shoulder and two other eyes met mine, I wheeled like a flash and seized a long knife from my dressing table, and my cousin sprang back very pale, crying, "Hildred, for God's sake!" Then as my hand fell, he said, "It's I, Lewis. Don't you know me?" I stood silent. I could not have spoken for my life. He walked up to me and took the knife from my hand. So again, Hildred is wearing the crown and thinking of Carcosa and the Yellow King, but this time he leaves it on for too long. It's interesting that he has to set an alarm to keep him from leaving the crown on for too long, but again, this time he ignores it. And we're given more clues as to this Yellow King story. Camilla can be assumed to be a character from the play. In the last lines of the first act, she screams in the streets of Carcosa. And again, this is before the play's second act that seems to draw people in and turn them mad. Words that even in Hildred's current state, he can't dare think about. When he says he looks in the mirror and sees a face that looks like his own, he says that the face is much thinner and wider. Or in other words, much more pale. The pallid mask that was mentioned earlier, pallid has the same root word as pale. In other words, the mask is pale or white or ghostly. So it seems that here, after wearing the crown too long and looking in the mirror, it's almost as if Hildred sees a sickly version of himself that is beginning to take on characteristics like the pallid mask. And whatever this grand scheme is, as Hildred says, the day has come. And it takes Lewis showing up for him to snap out of it, and even then, it's after Hildred swings a knife at Lewis. Lewis is a trooper for putting up with this guy, by the way. When Lewis tells Hildred to take all of that off, Lewis remarks, "Take off that brass crown and toddle into the study." Then after this, Hildred says, "I was glad he thought the crown was made of brass and paste, yet I didn't like him any better for thinking so." And then while holding the crown, Lewis says, "It's dear at 50 cents, he said. What's it for?" And then Hildred says, "I did not answer, but took the circlet from his hands and placing it in the safe, shut the massive steel door." So Lewis has twice referred to the crown as brass and worth 50 cents. Lewis could be wrong, or what I think is more likely is it's actually a worthless crown, but in Hildred's mind, it's a golden crown full of diamonds. I mean, it makes sense that that's in his head, because how would this guy afford like a super expensive crown otherwise? I mean, maybe if Mr. Wilde is right about being a repairer of reputations, but again, I'm pretty sure he's lying. Lewis also points out something interesting in Hildred's house when he says, "See here, old fellow," he began, "I've got something to suggest to you. It's 4 years now that you've shut yourself up here like an owl, never going anywhere, never taking any healthy exercise, never doing a damn thing but poring over those books up there on the mantelpiece." He glanced along the row of shelves. "Napoleon, Napoleon, Napoleon," he read. "For heaven's sake, have you nothing but Napoleons there?" "I wish they were bound in gold," I said. It seems that Hildred is wanting to adopt this mindset of a ruler, a rule that he thinks he is entitled to. And he's done nothing for the past few years except meet with Mr. Wilde and read books about how to do that. But what's more interesting is what Hildred says right after. "But wait, yes, there is another book. The King in Yellow." I looked him steadily in the eye. "Have you never read it?" I asked. No, thank God. I don't want to be driven crazy." I saw he regretted his speech as soon as he had uttered it. "There is only one word which I loathe more than I do lunatic, and that word is crazy." But I controlled myself and asked him why he thought the King in Yellow dangerous. "Oh, I don't know," he said hastily. "I only remember the excitement it created and the denunciations from pulpit and press. I believe the author shot himself after bringing forth this monstrosity, didn't he?" "I understand he is still alive," I answered. "That's probably true," he muttered. "Bullets couldn't kill a fiend like that." "It is a book of great truths," I said. "Yes," he replied, "of truths which send men frantic and blast their lives. I don't care if the thing is, as they say, the very supreme essence of art. It's a crime to have written it, and I, for one, shall never open its pages." Again, we have another mention of Hildred getting violent at words like lunatic and crazy. But what's interesting is Lewis has also heard of The King in Yellow and has heard that anyone who has read it has gone insane. Again, certainly wouldn't apply to Hildred or anything. We never get more details about that whole mention of the author shooting himself but potentially being alive. But I think it more so goes to show no one knows where the book came from, and there's all these urban legends around who the author even is. Another detail here, and I might be reading too far into this, but Lewis says the exact same phrases that Hildred did when he introduced the King in Yellow in the first place. Specifically, when Lewis says the denunciations from pulpit and press, and when he says it contains the very supreme essence of art. Those are both direct quotes that Hildred had earlier in the story, which might be Hildred not really having a grasp of what the outside world has been doing in the past several years. So earlier, while attempting to sound stoic and like a point of information for the reader, he was just quoting what Lewis said. His grasp on the world isn't as concrete as he may want others to see. Lewis then says that the reason he has visited Hildred is to tell Hildred that he is to be married. And at this, Hildred says, I believe for a moment my heart ceased to beat, but I kept my eyes on his face. As you can imagine, Lewis is getting married to Constance. And again, all of this seems to be a major point of contention for Hildred. Lewis also says that his regiment is being moved tomorrow, so they're having the wedding tomorrow so that Constance can go with him. And not only that, but as a wedding present, he is being promoted to captain. So things are going comedically well for Lewis. I'm sure nothing bad will happen. Hildred continues to the reader and says, Then he told me where it was to be and who were to be there, and made me promise to come and be best man. It really is heartbreaking how much Lewis cares for Hildred. I set my teeth and listened to his boyish chatter without showing what I felt, but I was getting to the limit of my endurance, and when he jumped up and, switching his spurs till they jingled, said he must go, I did not detain him. There's one thing I want to ask of you, I said quietly. Out with it. It's promised, he laughed. I want you to meet me for a quarter of an hour's talk tonight. Of course, if you wish, he said, somewhat puzzled. Where? Anywhere. In the park there. What time, Hildred? Midnight. What in the name of... He began, but checked himself and laughed assented. I watched him go down the stairs and hurry away, his saber banging at every stride. He turned into Bleecker Street, and I knew he was going to see Constance. So, if Lewis is getting married tomorrow, then Hildred's got to do whatever he needs to do tonight. And Lewis, being the kind cousin that he is, agrees to meet Hildred in the park at midnight. He then says, I gave him 10 minutes to disappear and then followed in his footsteps, taking with me the jeweled crown and the silken robe embroidered with the yellow sign. So here we see that the sign is a quite literal symbol, and he has a robe that has the symbol drawn on it. Hildred races to Mr. Wilde, being sure to dodge Lewis, Constance, and Hawberk in the shop below. And when he gets up to Mr. Wilde's room, it says, I knocked and entered without ceremony. Mr. Wilde lay groaning on the floor, his face covered with blood, his clothes torn to shreds. Drops of blood were scattered about over the carpet, which had also been ripped and frayed in the evidently recent struggle. It's that cursed cat, he said, ceasing his groans and turning his colorless eyes towards me. She attacked me while I was asleep. I believe she will kill me yet. I think the reason that this is brought up in the story is because, Wilde portrays himself as like such an eloquent man, above society even, who's going to launch a coup to enact the Imperial Dynasty of America, and that every politician's in his pocket and stuff like that. And the guy is constantly in a life or death battle with a cat. Hildred is furious at this and gets a hatchet from the pantry and begins to make his way through the apartment to kill the cat, but he can't find the cat, so instead he just decides to sit down. There's one interpretation of this story some people have, that the cat isn't even real and that it's just like a figment of Hildred, or collectively Hildred and Mr. Wilde's imagination, or like Yellow King influence or whatever, which I don't think is true, but is funny to imagine. Hildred begins to read the Imperial Dynasty of America, and when he's done, Mr. Wilde turns to a dark hallway in the apartment and calls for someone named Vance. And then a man who had just been crouching in the shadows this whole time stands up and walks over to the table. Vance, this is Mr. Castaigne, said Mr. Wilde. Before he had finished speaking, the man threw himself on the ground before the table, crying and grasping. Oh God, oh my God, help me, forgive me. Oh, Mr. Castaigne, keep that man away. You cannot mean it. You are different. Save me. I am broken down. I was in a madhouse, and now, when all was coming right, when I had forgotten the king in yellow, but I shall go mad again. I shall go mad. His voice died into a choking rattle, for Mr. Wilde had leapt on him, and his right hand encircled the man's throat. When Vance fell in a heap on the floor, Mr. Wilde clambered nimbly into his chair again, and rubbing his mangled ears with the stump of his hand, turned to me and asked me for the ledger. I reached it down from the shelf, and he opened it. After a moment searching among the beautifully written pages, he coughed complacently and pointed to the name Vance. Vance, he read aloud. Osgood Oswald Vance. At the sound of his name, the man on the floor raised his head and turned a convulsed face to Mr. Wilde. His eyes were injected with blood, his lips tumefied. Called April 28th, continued Mr. Wilde. Occupation, cashier in the Seaforth National Bank. Has served a term of forgery at Sing Sing, from whence he was transferred to the asylum for the criminal insane. Pardoned by the governor of New York and discharged from the asylum, January 19th, 1918. Reputation damaged at Sheepshed Bay. Rumors that he lives beyond his income. Reputation to be repaired at once. Retainer, $1,500. Note, has embezzled sums amounting to $30,000 since March 20th, 1919. Excellent family and secured present position through uncle's influence. Father, president of Seaforth Bank. I looked at the man on the floor. Get up, Vance, Mr. Wilde said in a gentle voice. Vance rose as if hypnotized. He will do as we suggest now, observed Mr. Wilde, and opening the manuscript, he read the entire history of the Imperial Dynasty of America. Then, in a kind and soothing murmur, he ran over the important points with Vance, who stood like one stunned. His eyes were so blank and vacant that I imagined he had become half-witted, and remarked it to Mr. Wilde, who replied that it was of no consequence anyway. Very patiently, we pointed out to Vance what his share in the affair would be, and he seemed to understand after a while. Mr. Wilde explained the manuscript, using several volumes on heraldry to substantiate the result of his researches. He mentioned the establishment of the dynasty in Carcosa, the lakes which connected Hastur, Aldebaran, and the mystery of the Hyades. He spoke of Casilda and Camilla, and sounded the cloudy depths of Demi, and the lake of Hali. The scalloped tatters of the king in yellow must hide Yathil forever, he muttered, but I do not believe Vance heard him. Then, by degrees, he led Vance along the ramifications of the imperial family. To Uat and Thal, from now to Bala and Phantom of Truth, to Aldones, and then tossing aside his manuscript and notes, he began the wonderful story of the last king. Fascinated and thrilled, I watched him. He threw up his head, his long arms were stretched out in a deep, magnificent gesture of pride and power, and his eyes blazed deep in their sockets like two emeralds. Vance listened stupefied. As for me, when at last Mr. Wilde had finished and pointed to me, cried, "The cousin of the king!" My head swam with excitement. So let's break this down in order. Mr. Wilde has a man named Vance who was from a mental asylum and has now gone even more mad after coming across the King in Yellow. And Vance seems to be a mindless puppet that Mr. Wilde can control. Makes you kind of think of other people who might have had to stay in an asylum that Mr. Wilde might theoretically have control over. I mean, for all we know, if Mr. Wilde was lying about all the other information of reputations he's repairing, all that stuff about Osgood Oswald Vance could have just been made up. We get more mentions of this lost play. We get Camilla and Casilda as characters mentioned once again. We get a mention of the dynasty of Carcosa, whatever that means. But then we talk about the imperial family and how there is now a last king. And then when Mr. Wilde's done, he points to Hildred and says, "Behold, the cousin of the king." And now the story makes sense. Lewis matters because according to Mr. Wilde, Lewis is the one who is to be the king of the Imperial Dynasty of America. But Hildred, probably at the fueling of Mr. Wilde, believes that Lewis is unfit to be this last king. I mean, Lewis doesn't even know about the dynasty or the King in Yellow, right? So Hildred feels that he is fit for this throne, and he can't let Lewis get in the way of that. And since in our first mention of the Imperial Dynasty of America, it says that in this prophecy, the king is to have an heir, then that explains why Hildred doesn't want Lewis and Constance to get married, because then that makes Lewis a step closer to becoming the king. Also, it doesn't seem that Hildred thinks he'll become the King in Yellow, because earlier he says this king is fit to serve the King in Yellow. So it seems that they view the King in Yellow as a god or being to be worshipped, and this last king is just the agent of the King in Yellow on Earth, who is supposed to lead an empire in the name of the King in Yellow. Hildred clarifies this point about Lewis when he says, "Controlling myself with a superhuman effort, I explained to Vance why I alone was worthy of the crown, and why my cousin must be exiled or die. I made him understand that my cousin must never marry, even after renouncing all his claims, and how that least of all he should marry the daughter of the Marquis of Avonshire and bring England into the question. I showed him a list of thousands of names which Mr. Wilde had drawn up. Every man whose name was there had received the yellow sign which no living human being dared disregard. The city, the state, the whole land were ready to rise and tremble before the pallid mask." Again, a mask that Hildred saw himself wearing in the mirror earlier. And here we see where that mention of Hauberg being the Marquis of Avonshire earlier comes into play. See, Mr. Wilde was right about that piece of armor being found where it was in the city. But perhaps now he's only alleged Hawberk to be the Marquis of Avonshire because that means he's British. So if his daughter Constance marries Louis in this Imperial Dynasty of America, we'll also have an issue with British royalty times as if it's some kind of royal marriage. And of course, Hildred wants the throne to be his. He says the time had come, the people should know the son of Hastur, and the whole world bowed to the black stars which hang in the sky over Carcosa. Again, we only see glimpses of what this King in Yellow story even is, but in a lot of adaptations, Hastur is either the name of the King in Yellow or one of the first kings on Earth who served the King in Yellow. So it seems here that Hildred is referring to himself as the son of Hastur. But then we get this haunting line when it says, Vance leaned on the table, his head buried in his hands. Mr. Wilde drew a rough sketch on the margin of yesterday's Herald with a bit of lead pencil. It was a plan of Hawberk's rooms. Then he wrote out the order and affixed the seal, and shaking like a palsied man, I signed my first writ of execution with my name, Hildred Rex. So it seems that the reason Vance is here is because Mr. Wilde is going to have him murder Hawberk and Constance so that they can't get in the way. And Hildred, believing himself to be a soon-to-be king, signs it with a king's seal. Also, Rex is Latin for king, so he's literally signing his name as Hildred King. After this, Hildred leaves and goes to Washington Square, where the lethal chamber is, to meet with Louis at midnight. There's this little passage here. I don't know what it might mean or what the symbolism could be, but I just like it. It says, I had eaten nothing since breakfast, but I was not hungry. A wretched, half-starved creature who stood looking across the street at the lethal chamber noticed me and came up to tell me a tale of misery. I gave him money, I don't know why, and he went away without thanking me. Maybe it's a bit of like Hildred's humanity poking through in the midst of this. Maybe it's because he thinks he's soon to be king, but just that little interaction, it adds spice to the story. I like it. Following this, it says an hour later, another outcast approached and whined his story. I had a blank bit of paper in my pocket on which was traced the yellow sign, and I handed it to him. He looked at it stupidly for a moment, and then with an uncertain glance at me, folded it with what seemed to me exaggerated care, and placed it in his bosom. Again, it seems that those who have gone mad know what the yellow sign is. Perhaps the reason the lethal chamber's here in the first place, or there's so many deranged people in the city, is because this book exists. While describing the beauty of the street at night, Hilbert compares it a lot to Hawberk's shop and the beauty he would see in the armor Hawberk would create. Again, perhaps it's a little bit of Hilbert's humanity poking out. He may not outright say it, but when his mind thinks of nice things, it thinks of moments from Hawberk's shop. Eventually, at midnight, Louis meets Hilbert. The two of them go to sit at a bench, and Hilbert says that Louis is looking at him suspiciously. Hilbert remarking, he looked at me curiously, with the same searching glance which I hate and fear so in doctors. Again, another bit of animosity that Hilbert has to those who think him mad. Louis then begins to speak. Well, old chap, he inquired, what can I do for you? I drew from my pocket the manuscript and notes of the Imperial Dynasty of America, and looking him in the eye, said, I will tell you. On your word as a soldier, promise me to read this manuscript from beginning to end without asking me a question. Promise me to read these notes in the same way, and promise me to listen to what I have to tell later. I promise, if you wish it, he said pleasantly. Give me the paper, Hildred. He began to read, raising his eyebrows with a puzzled, whimsical air, which made me tremble with suppressed anger. As he advanced, his eyebrows contracted, and his lips seemed to form the word rubbish. Then he looked slightly bored, but apparently for my sake read, with an attempt at interest, which presently ceased to be an effort. He started when, in the closely written pages, he came to his own name, and when he came to mine, he lowered the paper and looked sharply at me for a moment. But he kept his word and resumed his reading, and I let the half-formed question die on his lips unanswered. When he came to the end and read the signature of Mr. Wilde, he folded the paper carefully and returned it to me. I handed him the notes, and he settled back, pushing his fatigue cap up to his forehead with a boyish gesture which I remembered so well in school. I watched his face as he read, and when he finished, I took the notes with the manuscript and placed them in my pocket. Then I unfolded a scroll marked with the yellow sign. He saw the sign, but he did not seem to recognize it, and I called his attention to it somewhat sharply. Before we get into the rest of this interaction, again, there's a couple things that I find interesting. For one, it's so funny to have all of this hype built up around the Imperial Dynasty of America and how Hildred describes when he reads it, he's like shaking and on the verge of tears. And then Lewis gets it and he's like, this is lame. Because again, Lewis hasn't been exposed to the King in Yellow or Mr. Wilde's teachings. So to him, it's just a fantasy about world domination that doesn't make any sense. But there's also that quick mention from Hildred when he talks about the way Lewis pushes his cap up and says that he remembers it so well from school. Again, little pieces of Hildred poking out that make you sympathize with him as a mentally ill man who's been taken advantage of by either the King in Yellow, Mr. Wilde, or both. I mean, Lewis just read a manuscript that says he is supposed to be the king of the Royal Dynasty of America, so he's probably a little caught off guard. After Hildred shows him the yellow sign, the two continue. Well, he said, I see it. What is it? It is the yellow sign, I said angrily. Oh, that's it, is it? Said Lewis in that flattering voice which Dr. Archer used to employ with me and would probably have employed again had I not settled his affair for him. So earlier when Lewis was reading the manuscript, it says that he looks at Hildred sharply. And now when he's starting to talk, he's talking very flatteringly and very softly. And it seems that Lewis realizes Hildred is not okay. Probably thinking to himself that Hildred needs a lot of help and right now might be dangerous. So keeping in mind that Lewis is now very aware of Hildred's state of mind and probably scared of him, the two continue. I kept my rage down and answered as steadily as possible. Listen. You have engaged your word. I'm listening, old chap, he replied soothingly. I began to speak very calmly. Dr. Archer, having by some means become possessed of the secret of the imperial succession, attempted to deprive me of my right, alleging that because of a fall from my horse 4 years ago, I had become mentally deficient. He presumed to place me under restraint in his own house in hopes of either driving me insane or poisoning me. I have not forgotten it. I visited him last night, and the interview was final. So it seems that Hildred did settle accounts with Dr. Archer as he murdered him yesterday. Lewis turned quite pale, but did not move. I resumed triumphantly. There are yet 3 people to be interviewed in the interest of Mr. Wilde and myself. They are my cousin, Lewis, Mr. Hawberk, and his daughter, Constance. Lewis sprang to his feet and I arose also and flung the paper marked with the yellow sign to the ground. Oh, I don't need that to tell you what I have to say, I cried with a laugh of triumph. You must renounce the crown to me. Do you hear? To me. Lewis looked at me with a startled air, but recovering himself said kindly, Of course, I renounce what is it I must renounce? The crown, I said angrily. Of course, he answered. I renounce it. Come, old chap, I'll walk back to your rooms with you. Don't try any of your doctor's tricks on me, I cried, trembling with fury. Don't act as if you think I'm insane. What nonsense, he replied. Come, it's getting late, Hildred. No, I shouted. You must listen. You cannot marry. I forbid it. Do you hear? I forbid it. You shall renounce the crown, and in reward I grant you exile. But if you refuse, you shall die. He tried to calm me, but I was roused at last, and drawing my long knife, barred his way. Then I told him how they would find Dr. Archer in the cellar with his throat open, and I laughed in his face when I thought of Vance and his knife and the orders signed by me. Ah, you are the king, I cried, but I shall be king. Who are you to keep me from empire over all the habitable earth? I was born the cousin of a king, but I shall be king. Lewis stood white and rigid before me. Suddenly, a man came running up 4th Street, entered the gate of the Lethal Temple, traversed the path to the bronze doors at full speed, and plunged into the death chamber with the cry of one demented. And I laughed until I wept tears, for I had recognized Vance and knew that Hawberk and his daughter were no longer in the way. Lewis is trying to agree to whatever Hildred has to say, and Hildred calls it out as the same way doctors used to speak to him. But as he's threatening Lewis, Vance runs into the lethal chamber, meaning Hawberk and Constance are already dead. Go, I cried to Lewis. You have ceased to be a menace. You will never marry Constance now, and if you marry anyone else in your exile, I will visit you as I did my doctor last night. Mr. Wilde takes charge of you tomorrow. when I turned and darted into South Fifth Avenue, and with a cry of terror, Lewis dropped his belt and saber and followed me like the wind. I heard him close behind me at the corner of Bleecker Street, and I dashed into the doorway under Hawberk's sign. He cried, "Halt or I fire!" But when he saw that I flew up the stairs, leaving Hawberk's shop below, he left me, and I heard him hammering and shouting at their doors as though it were possible to arouse the dead. Lewis was threatening to shoot him because he thought Hilbert was on his way to hurt Constance or Hawberk. But as soon as they get there and Hilbert makes his way up the staircase, Lewis loses interest because he just wants to make sure Constance is okay. But Hilbert, believing them to already be dead, makes his way to Mr. Wilde's apartment. Mr. Wilde's door was open, and I entered, crying, "It is done, it is done. Let the nations rise and look upon their king." But I could not find Mr. Wilde, so I went to the cabinet and took the splendid diadem from its case. Then I drew on the white silk robe embroidered with the yellow sign and placed the crown upon my head. At last I was king. King by my right in Hastur. King because I knew the mystery of the Hyades and my mind had sounded the depths of the lake of Hali. I was king. The first gray pencilings of dawn would raise a tempest which would shake 2 hemispheres. Then as I stood, my every nerve pitched to the highest tension, faint with the joy and splendor of my thought, without, in the dark passage, a man groaned. Even though Hildred didn't do much other than explaining to Lewis that Lewis was now in exile and that Hildred was now the rightful king, Hildred believes that he has taken the throne. But while standing there in his regalia, he hears a man groaning in the hallway, and it turns out that that is Mr. Wilde, who has been mauled almost to death by his cat. So in fury, Hildred takes a knife, murders the cat, and then goes over to Mr. Wilde, and the first story ends with these lines. Mr. Wilde lay on the floor with his throat torn open. At first I thought he was dead, but as I looked, a green sparkle came into his sunken eyes. His mutilated hand trembled, and then a spasm stretched his mouth from ear to ear. For a moment my terror and despair gave place to hope, but as I bent over him, his eyeballs rolled clean around in his head, and he died. Then while I stood, transfixed with rage and despair, seeing my crown, my empire, every hope and every ambition, my very life, lying prostrate there with the dead master, they came, seized me from behind, and bound me until my veins stood out like cords and my voice failed with the paroxysms of my frenzied screams. But I still raged, bleeding and infuriated among them, and more than one policeman felt my sharp teeth. Then, when I could no longer move, they came near. I saw old Hawberk, and behind him my cousin Lewis' ghastly face, and farther away, in the corner, a woman, Constance, weeping softly. "Ha! I see it now!" I shrieked. "You have seized the throne and the empire. Woe, woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the King in Yellow." And finally, an editor's note that reads, "Mr. Castaigne died yesterday in the asylum for the criminally insane." So it seems that finally Mr. Wilde was mauled to death by his cat. Again, if you take the interpretation that the cat isn't real, we do get that image of Hildred standing above him furious holding a knife. Maybe Hildred thought he stabbed the cat when in actuality he stabbed Mr. Wilde, or maybe the maulings that were happening to Mr. Wilde were due to Hildred. However you want to interpret that. I think it's funnier if the guy just got his throat ripped open by his cat. But of course, considering the commotion that was happening, the police came and arrested Hildred. And thankfully, it seems that Hawberk and Constance lived. I mean, Vance was so mad it wasn't surprising that he didn't follow through on the execution. Instead, he simply drove himself insane and ran into the lethal chamber. So thankfully, even though, Hildred went to an asylum and then died, it seemed that Lewis and Constance got their happy ending. That's something I kind of like about Chambers. He's credited with being like an early horror author, but a lot of the stories that he has written, especially the next one we're going to talk about, are very romantic in nature. And he seems to abstain from killing the young lovers or killing like the romance within a story. So while they get a happy ending, Hildred not so much. He goes to an asylum and then dies shortly after. Now, if you view this first story in isolation, it almost seems like the King in Yellow is simply an idea that Mr. Wilde planted into Hildred's head. There's never any supernatural elements. Mr. Wilde was just manipulating an unwell man to get what he wants. Through all this talk of grandeur and kings and old legends and prophecy. I mean, for all we know, Mr. Wilde just didn't like Constance or Hawberk because they made fun of him for being weird and called him crazy. So he convinced a mentally ill guy to go with this whole scheme that would get them killed. However, due to other stories we're going to read later, the King in Yellow certainly does have some supernatural properties. And we see greater effects of this in the world around Hildred. I mean, as crazy as he was, the government still built a lethal chamber in the middle of New York City. So while I do think Mr. Wilde was being manipulative, I think the King in Yellow, the actual story, was being manipulative as well. In later short stories, we're going to see how the story preys on the mentally sound, but here we see that the mentally unwell are incredibly susceptible to the story. They not only believe it and become obsessed with it, but they become agents of it. We get to mention earlier that Mr. Wilde was in an asylum, so while I think he was manipulative to some degree, he also could have been completely mad and acting on behalf of the King in Yellow mimetic entity itself. I mean, we get the mention earlier in the story that his face was very yellowed and sickly. Maybe the story has had just as great of an effect on Mr. Wilde as it did on Hildred. And what everyone else around them sees as Mr. Wilde being a manipulative man taking advantage of an unwell man, it could in actuality be the King in Yellow taking advantage of both of them. It's a fascinating story that was very ahead of its time, with an unreliable narrator who describes things to us that don't actually seem to be that way. Little character mentions of like things that Lewis says or things that Hawberk says. It's very well written and a good introduction to this King in Yellow concept. And again, gives us a lot of ideas of this fictional play we'll see more of. Things like Hastur and Carcosa and Yathil. Things to keep in mind as we move into the other stories within this book. Now, our first story is different from the other stories in The King in Yellow. Once again, Chambers, The King in Yellow. As the first story is the only one that is explicitly about the forgotten play. And all the other stories are seemingly romance or slice of life stories that the King in Yellow intrudes on. Everything that happened in that first story was a result of Hildred reading the story and then everything that followed after. Whereas now we see what happens when people run into the play. Regardless, our second story, The Mask, opens with another excerpt from the King in Yellow. Camilla says, "You, sir, should unmask." The stranger says, "Indeed." Casilda replies, "Indeed it's time. We all have laid aside disguise, but you." Stranger says, "I wear no mask." To which Camilla, terrified, turns to Casilda and says, "No mask? No mask." And we are told that this is from The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2. So this is the same Camilla that Hildred said was screaming at the end of Act 1. Maybe this series of events is what leads to her screaming. So we know that Camilla and Casilda are two different characters from within the play. And Camilla is terrified that the stranger isn't wearing a mask. Again, we only get small excerpts, but there's some different ways to interpret this. Maybe this was at some kind of ball or masquerade, and perhaps the stranger in reference is either the King in Yellow, or if the king is some godlike being, maybe Hastur. And Camilla believes the stranger to be wearing a pallid mask or the visage of the king, only for him to reveal that he wears no mask, meaning the person standing before her may be the originator of the pallid mask, or at least the thing that the pallid mask signifies. Regardless, we make our way into the second short story, The Mask, which for the most part is about a love triangle. But of course there's a weird science fiction twist to it that appears in the opening paragraph. Although I knew nothing of chemistry, I listened fascinated. He picked up an Easter lily which Genevieve had brought that morning from Notre Dame and dropped it into the basin. Instantly, liquid lost its crystalline clearness. For a second, the lily was enveloped in a milk-white foam, which disappeared, leaving the fluid opalescent. Changing tints of orange and crimson played over the surface, and then what seemed to be a ray of pure sunlight struck through from the bottom where the lily was resting. At the same instant, he plunged his hand into the basin and drew out the flower. "There is no danger," he explained. "If you choose the right moment, that golden ray is the signal." He held the lily toward me, and I took it in my hand. It had turned to stone, to the purest marble. "You see," he said, "it is without flaw. What sculptor could reproduce it?" The marble was white as snow, but in its depths the veins of the lily were tinged with palest azure, and a faint flush lingered deep in its heart. "Don't ask me the reason for that," he smiled, noticing my wonder. "I have no idea why the veins and heart are tinted, but they always are. Yesterday, I tried one of Genevieve's goldfish. There it is." The fish looked as if sculptured in marble, but if you held it to the light, the stone was beautifully veined with a faint blue, and from somewhere within came a rosy light like the tint which slumbers in an opal. I looked into the basin. Once more, it seemed filled with clearest crystal. So a sculptor, whose name we'll later learn is Boris, is speaking to our protagonist, who we'll later know as Alec, and Boris is showing Alec this new serum he has created. It appears as crystal clear water, but if any living thing is dropped into it, it immediately turns to marble, with light blue striations where the veins used to be, and a small glow at its center. It seems that whenever something living is dropped into the bath after this chemical reaction takes place, a beam of light comes up from the bath, which allows the marble creation to be taken out. Alec asks Boris what would happen if he put his hand in the solution before the orange beam showed through, and Boris says he doesn't know, but Alec probably shouldn't try it. It seems that Boris has created a chemical that turns living things to stone, or more specifically, perfect marble statues of themselves. The two theorize that perhaps the golden beam that comes up from the solution is the soul or life force of the creature that has now been turned to marble. Boris then remarks to Alec, "Stay to lunch. Genevieve will be here directly." "I saw her going to early mass," I said, "and she looked as fresh and sweet as that lily before you destroyed it." "Do you think I destroyed it?" said Boris gravely. "Destroyed, preserved, how can we tell?" Boris is married to a woman named Genevieve, and as we can see here, Alec also thinks Genevieve beautiful. Boris doesn't seem to take offense to this comment, as we'll later see the three of them are close friends. Perhaps a little too close, I might argue. From their conversation, we learned that Alec is a painter, and as shown to us, Boris is a sculptor of marble. Last year at an art gallery, he made a marble carving of Madonna. The statue was highly praised and sought after, but it made Boris nervous about what he's going to follow it up with. Alec also mentions that in Boris's studio is an unfinished rendition of the Fates. The Fates are a pretty common motif, especially within things like statues or artwork that has Greek influence. They're normally depicted as three women creating the three stages of life. The first, creating one's life from birth. The second, deciding the events that will occur throughout someone's life. And the third being the predestination of that person's death. This is normally depicted as the three women knitting together a tapestry of some kind. So the first one is getting the yarn together, the second is designing the pattern, and the third is cutting the cord. There's a mention in the Repair of Reputations that in front of the lethal chamber was a statue of the Fates, which is kind of darkly poetic to put in front of the place where people go to end their own life, a statue that says one's death is determined for them at the beginning. But if you'll also remember in the Repair of Reputations, it says that those Fates were created by a sculptor named Boris Yvain. And that is the Boris that we're reading about now, who is friends with Alec in The Mask. And if you'll also remember from our first story, Boris died at 23 years old. And in the story we're reading now, Boris is 23 years old. While that might be a bit of spoiler for things to come, I think it's important to point out thematically. The entire idea of the Fates is that at one's birth, everything that will happen to them in life and the time of their death is already decided. That's why the Fates come up a lot in stories that deal with concepts of predestination and free will. But because of Boris's creation in the first story, a group of statues that symbolize the predestination of death, they already give away what happens to him in the story we're reading before he's even dead. It's almost like by his free will to create these statues that represent predestination in our original tale, the context we're given signs his death certificate to the story we're reading now. The Fates will also matter to this story as well in a very literal way. You could even say that it's set in stone. Our protagonist Alec's love of Genevieve becomes very apparent on the third page. Perhaps my being in love with Genevieve had something to do with his affection for me. Not that it had ever been acknowledged between us, but after all was settled, and she had told me with tears in her eyes that it was Boris whom she loved, I went over to his house and congratulated him. The perfect cordiality of that interview did not deceive either of us, I always believed, although to one at least it was a great comfort. I do not think he and Genevieve ever spoke of the matter together, but Boris knew. Genevieve was lovely. The Madonna-like purity of her face might have been inspired by the Sanctus in Gonod's Mass, but I was always glad when she changed that mood for what we called her April maneuvers. She was often as variable as an April day. In the morning grave, dignified and sweet, at noon laughing, capricious, at evening whatever one least expected. I preferred her so rather than in that Madonna-like tranquility which stirred the depths of my heart. I was dreaming of Genevieve when he spoke. So it seemed that at some point Alec and Boris both loved Genevieve, until one day Genevieve tells Alec with tears in her eyes that it's Boris whom she loves. And seemingly Alec went along with that because he was friends with both of them and wanted them to be happy, but it is very apparent that those emotions are hard to kill. I think it's perfectly fine if one of your boys dates or marries a pretty girl and you say something to him like, "Good job, dude," or "That one's a keeper," but maybe don't say she has a Madonna-like tranquility that inspires sanctums in masses, and also that you are, dreaming about her, because that would be weird. While Alec is thinking of Boris's wife, Boris is thinking about the soup he made that turns things to stone. And Boris says, "I shall make no use of it, beyond satisfying my own curiosity so far as maybe, and the secret will die with me." It would be rather a blow to sculpture, would it not? We painters lose more than we ever gain by photography. Boris nodded, playing with the edge of his chisel. This new discovery would corrupt the world of art. "No, I shall never confide the secret to anyone," he said slowly. It's funny, for one, that Boris isn't thinking about the implications of turning living things to stone. Instead, he is worried about the effect it will have on the world of art. As they're talking, Boris says he has created a new element, and when Alec asks what he's named it, Boris says, "Oh, I haven't thought of naming it, and I don't believe I ever shall. There are enough precious metals now in the world to cut throats over." I pricked up my ears. "Have you struck gold, Boris?" "No, better. But see here, Alec," he laughed, starting up. "You and I have all we need in this world. Ah, how sinister and covetous you look already." I laughed too and told him I was devoured by the desire for gold, and we had better talk of something else. So when Genevieve came in shortly after, we had turned our backs on alchemy. It's funny how the scene's written right after Boris accuses Alec jokingly of being covetous of what Boris possesses, only for Alec to then turn the story back to Genevieve. He follows this up by saying, "Genevieve was dressed in silvery gray from head to foot. The light glinted along the soft curves of her fair hair as she turned her cheek to Boris. Then she saw me and returned my greeting. She had never before failed to blow me a kiss from the tips of her white fingers, and I promptly complained of the omission. She smiled and held out her hand, which dropped almost before it had touched mine. Then she said, looking at Boris, 'You must ask Alec to stay for luncheon.' This also was something new. She had always asked me herself until today." I understand that the three of them are really close, but I can't wrap my head around if I was hanging out with like a friend of mine and my wife came in and my friend was like, "Why haven't you blown me a kiss yet? You always blow me kisses." I think I would beat him to death, especially if I knew my friend had feelings for her previously before we got married, but 1890s, I guess. That's also something I should clarify. The Repair of Reputations was set in 1920 New York City, so just in the future from when Chambers was writing in 1890. This story seems to be set in 1890, but in France. That also makes sense because if Boris is 23 here and, about to die, spoilers, his statues have to somehow wind up in New York City 25 years later in front of the lethal chamber. Genevieve goes into another room and Boris and Alec discuss that she's acting kind of odd. When it then says, "While we were discussing the advisability of my departure, Genevieve reappeared in the doorway without her bonnet. She was wonderfully beautiful, but her color was too deep and her lovely eyes were too bright. She came straight up to me and took my arm. 'Luncheon is ready.' Was I cross, Alec? I thought I had a headache, but I haven't. Come here, Boris." And she slipped her other arm through his. "Alec knows that after you there is no one in the world whom I like as well as I like him. So if he sometimes feels snubbed, it won't hurt him." And then at the end it says, "Arm in arm we raced into the dining room, scandalizing the servants. After all, we were not so much to blame. Genevieve was 18, Boris was 23, and I not quite 21. Okay, so going back to the example from earlier, if my friend did the whole "where's my hug" thing to my wife about not blowing him a kiss, and then my wife came out of the room and put her arm through his arm, and then told me that there's no one in the world other than me that she cares for as much as my friend, I think I would kill both of them. Again, it's very cutesy and all, but Boris is ignoring a lot of warning signs, things that he will pay for in a moment. And we also see a mention of these April maneuvers that Alec was talking about earlier, when Genevieve will go from one high to a low to another emotion back and forth. She goes from kind of ignoring Alec to saying that Alec is her second favorite person in the world. But again, the three of them are effectively kids, and it seems that even though there is some unrequited love, they're all enjoying a good life around each other. Something that is sure to become a problem when the King in Yellow becomes involved. It's established that Boris and Genevieve live in a sort of hotel. Or if they don't live there, it's at least an artist studio that Boris has that occupies a lot of his time. And within this hotel, Boris has a room that is like a big indoor bath where there's these beautiful like marble sculptures along the edge of the room, and then in the center is a sunken pool. While in this room, Alec teases Boris, pretending to be a sculpture of Cupid that Boris is working on. And while joking around, Boris almost pushes Alec into the pool in the middle of the room before remembering that he filled the pool with the solution. Alec says, "In heaven's name, why do you keep a small lake of that gruesome stuff here of all places?" I asked. "I want to experiment on something large," he replied. "On me, for instance?" That came too close for jesting, but I do want to watch the action of that solution on a more highly organized living body. "There's that big white rabbit," he said, following me into the studio. So here we see a little bit of hypocrisy trickling through from Boris. He discovered this solution, this new element as he called it, in some unexplained way, which I have my theories on later. But he says that solution will only cause problems and the secret of how it is made should die with him. Only for us to now see him making more of the stuff to try to convert even larger things into marble sculptures. Even though he recognizes this new invention as a bad thing, he can't stop himself from wanting to learn more about it. Sound like any other piece of knowledge in these stories that people shouldn't read but feel compelled to? In addition to Boris and Alec, there's a third artist working within this hotel as well, a painter named Jack Scott. Keep the name Jack Scott in mind for a story that comes later. After he's done working that day, Alec decides to go to a smoking room inside of the hotel, and while laying on a couch, he falls asleep. The story then says this on page 40. "I awoke to the saddest music I have ever heard. The room was quite dark, and I had no idea what time it was. A ray of moonlight silvered one edge of the old spinet, and the polished wood seemed to exhale the sounds as perfume floats above a box of sandalwood. Someone rose in the darkness and came away weeping quietly, and I was fool enough to cry out, 'Genevieve?' She dropped at my voice, and I had time to curse myself while I made a light and tried to raise her from the floor. She shrank away with a murmur of pain. She was very quiet and asked for Boris. I carried her to the divan and went to look for him, but he was not in the house, and the servants were gone to bed. Perplexed and anxious, I hurried back to Genevieve. She lay where I had left her, looking very white. 'I can't find Boris nor any of the servants,' I said. 'I know,' she answered faintly. 'Boris has gone to Ept with Mr. Scott. I did not remember when I sent you for him just now.' 'But he can't get back in that case before tomorrow afternoon. Are you hurt? Did I frighten you into falling? What an awful fool I am, but I was only half awake. Boris thought you had gone home before dinner. Do please excuse us for letting you stay here all this time.' 'I have had a long nap,' I laughed. 'So sound that I did not know whether I was still asleep or not when I found myself staring at a figure that was moving toward me and called out your name. Have you been trying the old spinet? You must have played very softly.' I would tell 1,000 more lies worse than that one to see the look of relief that came into her face. She smiled adorably and said in her natural voice, 'Alec, I tripped on the wolf's head and I think my ankle is sprained. Please call Marie and then go home.' I did as she bade me and left her there when the maid came in." So Alec fell asleep at their house and awoke in the night to see Genevieve crying and playing the spinet, or in other words, a kind of piano. But when he calls out to her, she falls to the ground, and after talking, he says that he was still foggy and didn't know if he was awake or not and couldn't really tell what he saw, not wanting Genevieve to know that he heard her crying. Genevieve seems very troubled about something, but for now Alec doesn't pry. However, the next day when Alec goes to see Boris, Boris says that not only is Genevieve's ankle sprained, but that she has a fever and won't wake up. And while speaking of Genevieve, Boris says, "I should say so, and has actually been a little lightheaded at intervals all night. The idea, gay little Genevieve, without a care in the world. And she keeps saying her heart's broken and she wants to die." Now, as mentioned earlier, Genevieve seems to have these strong mood swings. But having a fever like this and saying she wants to die from heartbreak is odd even for her. Boris seems furious by this. His wife is sick and he can't do anything for her. Also, I keep using the word wife because we know that Genevieve and Boris are committed to each other. It's not explicitly said that they're married, but they're at least living together or close enough. Boris is pacing around very upset and decides to do something. Suddenly, he started for the next room. "Come and see my rose-colored bath full of death," he cried. "Is it death?" I asked, to humor his mood. "You are not prepared to call it life, I suppose," he answered. As he spoke, he plucked a solitary goldfish squirming and twisting out of its globe. "We'll send this one after the other, wherever that is," he said. And sure enough, Boris throws the goldfish into the large pool of the solution, and the goldfish, once again, in the bubbling water and the ray of light, is turned to marble. I also really like that exchange where Alex says, "Is it death?" And Boris says, "You are not prepared to call it life." And then before he throws the goldfish, saying, "We'll send this one after the other, wherever that is." Because yeah, they could be talking about, the afterlife, eternity or whatever, or just whatever this form of death or not death is he's doing to living creatures. "Child's play," he muttered, and looked warily, longingly at me, as if I could answer such questions. But Jack Scott came in and entered into the game, as he called it, with our door. Nothing would do but to try the experiment on the white rabbit then and there. I was willing that Boris should find distraction from his cares, but I hated to see the life go out of a warm, living creature, and I declined to be present. Alec isn't going to stop him from doing this, but he doesn't want to see the rabbit turned into a statue. So Alec decides to distract his time. And how does he do that? Picking up a book at random, I sat down in the studio to read. Alas, I found The King in Yellow. And there we go. The story now tying into ours. After a few moments, which seemed ages, I was putting it away with a nervous shudder when Boris and Jack came in bringing their marble rabbit. At the same time, the bell rang above, and a cry came from the sick room. Boris was gone like a flash, and the next moment he called, "Jack, run for the doctor, bring him back with you. Alec, come here." So we don't know yet what effect the King in Yellow had on Alec, but we already have signs of how it's affected Boris and Genevieve. Again, the book was in the studio of their house, so it's likely one or both of them read it. I think Boris read it for sure. I mean, he's come up with this solution that turns living things to stone. And he says the process to make it was incredibly easy, that he doesn't know how scientists haven't done it yet. In our first story, we saw how the King in Yellow affects those whose minds are long gone. But to artists, to those of a sound mind, it seems like it just gives ideas or influences. It didn't turn Boris to madness, but it did give him the idea to make this solution that turns things to marble that he has become obsessed with. And earlier in the story, we're told that Genevieve loved Boris, but now she seems to be deeply unhappy, perhaps another effect of the book. And now Alec has read it. So what does that mean for him? I went and stood at her door. A frightened maid came out in haste and ran away to fetch some remedy. Genevieve, sitting bolt upright with crimson cheeks and glittering eyes, babbled incessantly and resisted Boris's gentle restraint. He called me to help. At my first touch, she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes. Then, as we still bent above her, she opened them again, looked straight into Boris's face, poor fever-crazed girl, and told her secret. At the same instant, our three lives turned into new channels. The bond that held us so long together snapped forever, and a new bond was forged in its place. For she had spoken my name. And as the fever tortured her, her heart poured out its load of hidden sorrow. Amazed and dumb, I bowed my head, while my face burned like a live coal, and the blood surged in my ears, stupefying me with its clamor. Incapable of movement, incapable of speech, I listened to her feverish words in an agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I could not look at Boris. Then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine. "It's not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve so if she loves you," he could not finish, and as the doctor stepped swiftly into the room, saying, "Ah, the fever," I seized Jack Scott and hurried him to the street, saying, "Boris would rather be alone." We crossed the street to our own apartments, and that night, seeing I was going to be ill too, he went for the doctor again. The last thing I recollect with any distinctness was hearing Jack say, "For heaven's sake, doctor, what ails him to wear a face like that?" And I thought of the King in Yellow and the pallid mask. If Boris was given the gentle push to simply think of this chemical that can turn life to stone, if that was the evil influence that was inserted into his life, then we see the evil influence that was inserted in a Genevieve and now Alec's life. Genevieve loved Boris, and it seemed was perfectly happy with the situation the three had. Until recently, she suddenly wasn't. She gets ill, says that she's dying from heartbreak, and as soon as Alec reads The King in Yellow, she makes her feelings known. While we don't know exactly what she says, she looks Boris in the face and confesses her love for Alec. And now Alec, under The King in Yellow's influence, sees that his best friend's wife is in love with him. And as we know, he's always had feelings for her. And once again, we get a mention from Jack Scott that Alec has adopted a pale face. A pallid face, much like the pallid mask. And it's not the strain of the story that has caused him to become sick, it is what Genevieve told him. What is making him sick is the thing that the King in Yellow inserted into his life. The knowledge that his friend's wife truly loves him. And we see that now all of those emotions that Alec had previously pushed away and didn't feel right to bring up are all coming to the surface. I was very ill. For the strain of 2 years which I had endured since the fatal May morning when Genevieve murmured, "I love you, but I think I love Boris best," told on me at last. I had never imagined that it could become more than I could endure. Outwardly tranquil, I had deceived myself. Although the inward battle raged night after night, and I, lying alone in my room, cursed myself for rebellious thoughts unloyal to Boris and unworthy of Genevieve, the morning always brought relief. And I returned to Genevieve and to my dear Boris with a heart washed clean by the tempest of the night. Never in word or deed or thought while with them had I betrayed my sorrow even to myself. The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me. It was a part of me. Night lifted it, laying bare the stifled truth below. But there was no one to see except myself. And when the day broke, the mask fell back again of its own accord. These thoughts passed through my troubled mind as I lay sick. But they were hopelessly entangled with visions of white creatures, heavy as stone, crawling about in Boris's basin, of the wolf's head on the rug, foaming and snapping at Genevieve, who lay smiling beside it. I thought, too, of the King in Yellow, wrapped in the fantastic colors of his tattered mantle, and that bitter cry of Casilda, "Not upon us, O King, not upon us." Feverishly I struggled to put it from me, but I saw the lake of Hali, thin and blank, without a ripple or wind to stir it, and I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon. Aldebaran, the Hyades, Alar, Hastur, glided through the cloud rifts which fluttered and flapped as they passed like the scalloped tatters of the King in Yellow. Among all these, one sane thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Genevieve. What this obligation was, its nature, was never clear. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support through a great crisis. Whatever it seemed to be for the time, its weight rested only on me, and I was never so ill or so weak that I did not respond with my whole soul. There were always crowds of faces above me, mostly strange, but a few I recognized. Boris among them. Afterward they told me that this could not have been, but I know that once at least he bent over me. It was only a touch, a faint echo of his voice. Then the cloud settled back on my senses, and I lost him. But he did stand there and bent over me once at least. So we see that the King in Yellow fully has his hooks in Alec. All of his talk about how he had put his emotions away for 2 years, how he was perfectly happy with life continuing the way that it was. Now, that doesn't satisfy him. Now he talks about how at night he always thought about Genevieve, and even though it betrayed Boris and her, he couldn't help himself. And in the day he wore a mask, but at night that mask would slip. Which this is the mask that I believe the story is titled after, The Mask. And even though never in their presence did he have any thoughts of doing anything that would hurt either of them, now it seems to be all he can think about. He has visions of Genevieve lying on the floor laughing, tempting him. And at the same time that his mind is building up the image of Genevieve as wonderful, it's building up Boris as a monster that has creatures made of stone crawling from his pool. But of course, he has images of the story itself. Again, these vague mentions of the Lake of Hali and seeing the tatters of the King in Yellow's mantle. We get a few more excerpts from the play. At some point, Casilda cries, "Not upon us, O King, not upon us." And we get mentions of figures like Alar and Hastur gliding through the clouds. But in spite of this, Alec is trying to hold on. He's trying to think that Boris and Genevieve are his friends and he doesn't want to hurt them. But it's hard. He says several different people, assumedly doctors and friends, come to stand over him, but once he saw Boris. Even as he says now, that couldn't have been possible. After several days, Alex starts to feel better. He takes note that no one around him has mentioned anything about Boris or Genevieve. He assumes this is because of the awkwardness from Genevieve's outburst, and Alec has made it up in his mind that he would say hi to them, make sure everyone was okay, and then disappear from their lives forever. The greater part of him, the part that is loyal to both of them, does not want either of them to be hurt. So when he gets to feeling better, he will see them once more and then vanish forever. I beckoned Jack to me one day and said, "Jack, I want Boris at once. Take my dearest greeting to Genevieve." When at last he made me understand that they were both dead, I fell into a wild rage that tore all my little convalescent strength to atoms. I raved and cursed myself into a relapse, from which I crawled forth some weeks afterward, a boy of 21 who believed that his youth was gone forever. I seemed to be past the capability of further suffering, and one day when Jack handed me a letter and the keys to Boris's house, I took them without a tremor and asked him to tell me all. It was cruel of me to ask him, but there was no help for it, and he leaned wearily on his thin hands to reopen the wound which could never entirely heal. He began very quietly. "Alec, unless you have a clue that I know nothing about, you will not be able to explain any more than I what has happened. I suspect that you would rather not hear these details, but you must learn them, else I would spare you the relation. God knows I wish I could be spared the telling. I shall use few words. That day when I left you in the doctor's care and came back to Boris, I found him working on the fates. Genevieve, he said, was sleeping under the influence of drugs. She had been quite out of her mind, he said. He kept on working, not talking anymore, and I watched him. Before long I saw that the third figure of the group, the one looking straight ahead, out over the world, bore his face. Not as you ever saw it, but as it looked then and to the end. This is one thing for which I should like to find an explanation, but I never shall." This is such an interesting detail to throw in the story. See, the third fate is often the one that represents the end of life. Depending on the depiction of the fates, sometimes the second one is the one that's looking out, as that's the one that's dedicated to the events that happen in your life, between birth and death. But since he says third one, I assume he's talking about the one relating to death. And in these final hours, after Genevieve has confessed her love to Alec, Jack Scott sees the image of what Boris looked like in those final hours carved into the stone. And it's almost like the influence of the King in Yellow had done its job. It had successfully put a wedge between the three of them, and now, at the end of his days, it is compelling Boris to put his own face on the representation of death. When I said earlier that the first story of this anthology, that the statue of the Fates gives away what happens to Boris in this story, that couldn't be represented more clearly than Boris putting his own face on the visage of death. Well, he worked and I watched him in silence, and we went on that way until nearly midnight. Then we heard the door open and shut sharply, and a swift rush in the next room. Boris sprang through the doorway and I followed, but we were too late. She lay at the bottom of the pool, her hands across her breast. Then Boris shot himself through the heart. Jack stopped speaking. Drops of sweat stood under his eyes, and his thin cheeks twitched. I carried Boris to his room. Then I went back and let that hellish fluid out of the pool, and turning on all the water, washed the marble clean of every drop. When at length I dared descend the steps, I found her lying there as white as snow. At last, when I had decided what best to do, I went into the laboratory and first emptied the solution in the basin into the waste pipe. Then I poured the contents of every jar and bottle after it. There was wood in the fireplace, so I built a fire. Breaking the locks of Boris's cabinet, I burnt every paper, notebook, and letter that I found there. With a mallet from the studio, I smashed to pieces all the empty bottles, then loading them into a coal scuttle, I carried them to the cellar and threw them over the red-hot bed of the furnace. 6 times I made the journey, and at last not a vestige remained of anything which might again aid in seeking for the formula which Boris had found. Then at last I dared call the doctor. He is a good man. Together we struggled to keep it from the public. Without him I never could have succeeded. At last we got the servants paid and sent away into the country, where old Rossier keeps them quiet with stories of Boris and Genevieve's travels in distant lands, from whence they will not return for years. We buried Boris in the little cemetery of Sèvres. The doctor is a good creature, and knows when to pity a man who can bear no more. He gave his certificate of heart disease and asked no questions of me. Then, lifting his head from his hands, he said, "Open the letter, Alec. It's for both of us." I tore it open. It was Boris's will dated a year before. He left everything to Genevieve, and in case of her dying childless, I was to take control of the house in the Rue Saint-Cécile, and Jack Scott, the management of the Ept. On our desks, the property reverted to his mother's family in Russia, with the exception of the sculptured marbles executed by himself. These he left to me. The page blurred under our eyes, and Jack got up and walked to the window. Presently, he returned and sat down again. I dreaded to hear what he was going to say, but he spoke with the same simplicity and gentleness. Genevieve lies before the Madonna in the marble room. The Madonna bends tenderly above her, and Genevieve smiles back into that calm face that never would have been, except for her. His voice broke, but he grasped my hand, saying, "Courage, Alec." Next morning, he left for Ept to fulfill his trust. It seems that if the King in Yellow compelled Boris to carve his face into the stone of the fates, then it seems it also compelled Genevieve to turn her face to stone as well. Tragically, Boris left everything to Alec. And it is so haunting that Jack mentions Genevieve is now the statue in front of the Madonna within Boris's house that Alec now owns. It's mentioned earlier in the story that Genevieve sat for the sculpture of the Madonna. So it is a statue that was made in the image of Genevieve, looking at the literal statue of Genevieve. And the way to make this chemical solution was destroyed by Jack, meaning that as Boris wished in the beginning, the secrets of how to make it died with him. Perhaps this is the reason that Alec came out of his haze. It's like the King in Yellow had the three of them under a cloud, and when its will was completed with Boris and Genevieve, and the two are now dead, Alec has no one else to fawn after, so it lets him go. Or perhaps Alec managed to drive through it because of his humanity, because of his friendship. Because he maintained that thought that he doesn't want to hurt either of them, he was able to break the curse that the King in Yellow had laid upon him. But it seems that Boris and Genevieve were unable to do so. So Alec goes to the house that is now his and comes to the locked doors of the studio where Genevieve's statue now stands. And he can't bring himself to open the doors, so he locks the house up and decides to travel for a couple years. During this time, he stays in contact with Jack Scott. And in one of Jack's letters, Jack says, "What you tell me of seeing Boris bending over you while you lay ill and feeling his touch on your face and hearing his voice, of course, troubles me. This that you describe must have happened a fortnight after he died. I say to myself that you were dreaming, that it was part of your delirium, but the explanation does not satisfy me, nor would it you. Perhaps the ghost of Boris, perhaps the Yellow King within the form of Boris, perhaps after the Yellow King has its hooks in people, it takes their soul somewhere else. It has possession of them like the devil to which they've signed a contract. Perhaps in some way the ghost of Boris did visit Alec as he lay sick in his room." In another letter that Jack writes to Alec, he says, "I have not a care of my own, but I am more restless than if I had. I am unable to shake off a strange anxiety about you. It is not apprehension, it is rather a breathless expectancy of what, God knows. I can only say it's wearing me out. Nights I dream always of you and Boris. I can never recall anything afterward, but I wake in the morning with my heart beating, and all day the excitement increases until I fall asleep at night to recall the same experience. I am quite exhausted by it, and have determined to break up this morbid condition. I must see you." For some reason, Jack has this anxiety that the story between Boris, Alec, and Genevieve isn't done. After the two meet, they discuss some things. They go to Boris's grave, and Alec remarks that they should put the statue of Madonna to watch over him. After a couple years had passed and seen Jack, Alec is ready to go back to Boris's home, which is now his. And he begins to live in and enjoy the area and ventures to all the rooms of the house, except of course the studio that holds Genevieve's statue. Until one day, he can't take it anymore. After living in the house for some time, he becomes desperate to see Genevieve's face again, even if it's just the stone face of what was. The heavy doors swung inward under my trembling hands. Sunlight poured through the window, tipping with gold the wings of Cupid, and lingered like a nimbus over the brows of the Madonna. Her tender face bent in compassion over a marble form so exquisitely pure that I knelt and signed myself. Genevieve lay in the shadow under the Madonna, and yet through her white arms I saw the pale azure vein, and beneath her softly clasped hands the folds of her dress were tinged with rose, as if from some faint warm light within her breast. Bending with a breaking heart, I touched the marble drapery with my lips, and crept back into the silent house. Shortly after this, a maid comes and brings Alec a letter. The letter is from Jack Scott, and Jack is freaking out, saying that he is praying for Alec and he had a dream and he's having visions, and whatever Alec does, he must not leave the house, and Jack is coming there at once. While Alec is reading this, the maid is standing there holding a fishbowl with 2 goldfish. The maid says that she expects someone in the house is playing a trick on her. As where the 2 marble goldfish were earlier, there were now these 2 live goldfish flopping about. And where the marble rabbit was earlier, someone had replaced it with a live white rabbit. Alec, unsure what's going on, makes his way to the marble lily that the story began with to see that it is reverted into a lily as fresh as the one that was placed into the solution all those years ago. And then the story ends with these lines. Then suddenly I comprehended and sprang through the hallway to the marble room. The doors flew open, the sunlight streamed into my face, and through it, in a heavenly glory, the Madonna smiled, as Genevieve lifted her flushed face from her marble couch and opened her sleepy eyes. So Genevieve lived, and presumably gets to live the rest of her life with Alec. This is what I mean about, despite the horrors that Chamber exposes us to, there's a deep romanticism involved. In the first story, as mad and dangerous as Hildred was, Lewis and Constance still got to be together. They got their happy ending. And in this story, quite literally, true love's kiss breaks the spell. He goes to the marble statue of Genevieve that's been in there for years, and when he kisses her dress, everything that was marble begins to revert to its true form. Now, this doesn't mean that the King in Yellow was without consequence. I mean, Boris did die. And perhaps, depending on how you interpret the story, before the influence of the King in Yellow, Genevieve might have been happy to live with Boris and Alec as their close friend forever. But we know to some degree before the King's influence that she did care for Alec. Now the 2 of them have each other. It's not that the love or humanity within the story breaks the influence or the impact of the King in Yellow, it just makes it better. And it seemed that the visions Jack Scott was having were of good things. He didn't know why he had this anticipation for what Alec would do, but it turns out it's because Alec and Genevieve would be together again. This also furthers my belief that Boris coming up with the chemical idea in the first place was the direct influence of the King in Yellow, as it's not just a matter of alchemy to turn things to stone, it's a kind of curse. The mention in the goldfish and the flower and Genevieve statue all having a deep glow within its chest meant that they were still alive down there. And once again, when Alec kissed her statue, the curse was broken. So we see in this story what happens when the King in Yellow touches those of a sound mind. It doesn't necessarily hijack them, but it gives them temptation. Temptation to chase a forbidden science, or temptation to throw away a love to chase another. And while the curse was broken, it was not without its consequences. We saw that Alec was tempted with the idea of Genevieve, but he kept his mind solid on his love for Boris and was able to push through it. But we see that Boris didn't do the same thing for the chemical he had created. In the beginning of the story, he says it's awful and he should throw it away, but yet he makes more. Perhaps if Boris threw off this temptation, he could have gotten better as well. It's almost like the King in Yellow itself is representative of a lot of evils that enter the world. If you want to call it temptation, if you want to call it sickness, if you want to call it sin, it's like the play is a disease that rots the mind and drags you further away from your humanity into what the king would have you to do. And while yes, the play has literal features, we get more mentions of things like Casilda or Camilla or of the Lake of Hali. But its influence is the essence of that which wears away at the mind. With that, let's move into our third story, In the Court of the Dragon. In the Court of the Dragon is the shortest of the ones we're going to cover today, and it's also the most explicitly horror, I guess you could say. Maybe the fourth one beats it out, but the third is more standard of a horror story from the time. The quote reads, "O thou who burn'st in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn. How long be crying, mercy on them, God? Why? Who art thou to teach, and he to learn?" Basically saying it is useless to take pity on the souls that are in hell, because for one, you'll join them one day, and two, who are you to tell God what morality is? The story opens with someone in the Church of St. Barnaby setting in for a church service. There's this really weird thing in the first paragraph when it's talking about the service, where it says, "Behind him came that eloquent preacher and good man, Monsieur C." And when you look at that, that looks to me like a redaction. Look at this, all the way back in 1895. Robert Chambers paving the way for modern internet horror stories by redacting the name of the Reverend. I wonder what SCP he was. In the beginning, our protagonist is talking about how beautiful the church is. He speaks of how he loves to come here and see the Catholic procession and hear the beautiful organ music, but today, the organ music is different. He says that today the organ music sounds sinister for some reason. From where he's sitting, he can't see who the organ player is, but it's definitely not standard of a Sunday service. However, he seems to be the only one who notices this. He kind of forgets about it and lets his mind wander as the service carries on. But now when they get to another part of the service where the organ is to be played, an even more sinister music begins. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony. But I felt that in the labyrinth of sounds now issuing from that instrument, there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him, while the manuals blared approval. Poor devil. Whoever he was, there seems small hope of escape. Ah, look at that. Foreshadowing. Ha ha ha. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play like that in the midst of divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be in the least disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns still turned towards the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monsieur C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing Ave Maria. Again, while he is terrified of the music coming from the organ, he seems to be the only one who finds it odd. It's almost as if he's the only one that can hear it. And in the next paragraph, we get an explanation as to why. But now at last the preacher had made the sign of the cross and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far, I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered St. Barnaby that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausted body and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favorite church for healing. For I had been reading The King in Yellow. So we immediately see how The King in Yellow ties into this story. Before our story even began, our protagonist read The King in Yellow, and he is now seeking out religion in order to take that burden from him. The preacher begins preaching. The service begins, but as it does, our protagonist is drawn to look again to the organ. He sees the organ player cross from the organ to a small door that leads to the street outside. He says that he was a slender man, and his face was as white as his coat was black. But our protagonist is happy to see him go and turns his mind back towards the sermon. My children, said the preacher, one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn, that it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it. Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that with the fathers. Nothing can really harm the soul, he went on in his coolest, clearest tones. Because... But I never heard the rest. My eye left his face, I knew not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ and was passing along the gallery the same way. But there had not been time for him to return, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill and my heart sank, and yet his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite to me, he turned and sent across the church straight into my eyes a look of hate, intense and deadly. I have never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. Then he disappeared by the same door through which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. For one, I like the little excerpt of the sermon we hear where the pastor says that the soul itself can never be harmed. Because if our last story, The Mask, is anything to go off of, it is the soul or the heart of humans that is the one thing that can pierce through the influence of the King in Yellow. But of course, our protagonist of this story never gets to hear the rest as the organ player draws his attention. An organ player who he describes as having a strikingly white face. A white face, or perhaps a pale face, or perhaps a pallid face, or perhaps the image of the pallid mask. As you probably put together, the loop of the organ player walking from the organ to the door is supernatural. He did it just a few moments before, and it was too quick for him to have gone back to the organ and done it again, especially without our protagonist seeing. And before our story even began, this guy was under the influence of the King in Yellow. So it seems that whoever this organ player is an agent of the king that has nothing for him but hate. Eventually, our character convinces himself that he's just seeing things. There must have been another side door that is closer to the organ, and the guy just walked around outside of the church, and he has a problem with him for some reason, but who cares? He remarks to himself, besides, I'm in a church right now, and if there was ever a place for the devil or devilish creatures to be shooed off, it would be in here. But we get a little bit of hypocrisy here in our protagonist's description. He says, I laughed to myself over this conceit, which at the time I thought very amusing, and sat and chafed myself and everything else from the old harpy outside the railing, who had made me pay 10 cent times for my chair before she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monsieur C. himself. For all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. He goes from his desperation and gratefulness to be in the church to talking about how it's ridiculous that a nun would ask any money of him for the church, even mocking the preacher and his stoic nature. It seems that the guy who was so desperate for religious comfort, as soon as he's able to rationalize the organist in his mind, thinks the church foolish. He begins repeating a jingle to himself that says, the skirts of St. Paul has reached, having preached us those 6 Lent lectures, more unctuous than ever he preached. This is from an old poem called Up at a Villa Down in the City. And in the poem, it's talking about a ridiculous church service. Now, some have interpreted this story to be a criticism against religion. The organist at the church is the vessel of the King in Yellow, so it being there and the church not providing the safe haven the protagonist wants means that the church can't do anything for you. But I don't think that's the case for a couple reasons. For one, Robert Chambers was Catholic, and in a lot of his writings there seems to be positive things associated with Catholicism, so I don't think he's talking negatively about it here. And also, it seems that being in the church was the safe haven, at least for the time. There was the influence of the King in Yellow in the organ music and the organ player on the outskirts of the sanctuary. But the problems don't begin until our protagonist rejects the idea of the church he's sitting within. I mean, if the theme we've seen through the first couple of stories is true, that the soul can reject or push off the influence of the King in Yellow, then the preacher was the one who delivered that message to our protagonist. As he's trying to tell our character that the soul cannot be harmed, the appearance of the organ player cuts him off. And it's from there that our character begins to disregard the idea of the church. Just as the King in Yellow tried to incorporate the influence of rule and wealth in our first story, or of infidelity or alchemy in the second story, here it's trying to turn away the idea of outside help from religion or churches, instead leaving our character alone with his inner turmoil. After this, our character says, it was no use to sit in there any longer. I must get out of the doors and shake myself free from this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still I rose and left the church. As he's walking through the street, it's a beautiful day. People are laughing and singing, but then someone bumps his shoulder and walks past him in the crowd. And from the back, he can tell by the spiteful aura that that's the organ player. And here our protagonist says something interesting after witnessing the organ player pass him in the crowd. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn in me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he threatened. It reached a long way back, a long, long way back. It had lain dormant all these years. It was there, though, and presently it would rise and confront me. You could view this, if you view the King in Yellow and the organ player now as representative of death itself or inevitability. Then maybe our character is just referring to the primordial urge or threat of death that follows him everywhere, and he feels he deserves death in some way, as all people deserve death in some way. You can also view this as some kind of unforgivable sin in our character's past that he has yet to confront until now, and that the menace the organ player carries is a punishment that he's had a long time coming. So he switches up streets, but while he's walking down another street, he sees the organ player pass again. He leaves the riverside he was walking on and walks through a park in town. He says, in the full glow, he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger, like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed on the malignant hatred of his face. But he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him near to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate. And still, I tried to save myself. There is an inevitability that the organ player is getting closer and closer, but yet our character runs from it. He keeps walking and passes a crowd, and the organ player emerges from the crowd and gets so close he brushes against him. He says his slender frame felt like iron inside its loose black covering. He showed no signs of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing: the will and the power to work me evil. Eventually, he just starts making random turns and running throughout the city, finding himself that evening at a small cafe. He says an interesting line: "I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home, but that was a long way off." It seems that in his running from this inevitability, he had gotten so far from home that he could not find his way back. He tells us that he lives in a place called the Court of the Dragon. It's called this because at the entryway there is a giant walkway that is supported by a large iron dragon. When he talks about his home 5 flights up, he says it's the hiding place of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here to live, I was young and not alone. Perhaps he had a wife that left him at some point or died, and perhaps he feels responsible for whatever happened. Perhaps that's the reason he feels this inevitability is something he is owed. Eventually, he gets a horse cab to take him home, and despite it being an 1.5-hour ride back to his house, he never sees the organ player again. And eventually, he makes it back to where he lives, back to the Court of the Dragon. My apartment was at the top of a house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street, with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him, 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church, they met now again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backward, down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance on the Rue du Dragon. His eyes told me that I should never escape. It seemed ages while we were going, I retreating, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring through into the street, but the shadow was not that of an archway, it was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue du Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows, the point from which it would strike with his infernal eyes. Hopeless, I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. So while our character thought he was outrunning the organ player was always going to be home when he got there. And as he tries to make his way back onto the street to continue his run again, the gates to the court are closed. And here our character succumbs to whatever the organ player has in store. Now, of course, within the story, the organ player is representative of the King in Yellow. Not only had our protagonist read it, and that's what sent him down this spiral, but the organ player is specifically described as having a white face or bearing the pallid mask. Things we've heard mentioned about Hildred and Alec in previous stories, 2 people who also fell to the King in Yellow. But in analyzing this story on its own, there's a couple of things we see the organ player representative of. The most obvious, of course, is death. As mentioned earlier, if our character is feeling this primordial urge to resist death, even though it's inevitable, then the organ player is sort of the stand-in for the Grim Reaper. Despite how much he tries to run from it, death is always waiting. It reminds me of that short story, An Appointment in Samara. So there's a lot of different renditions of this short story. It's originally said to be an ancient Mesopotamian tale, that one of the first versions was written down in the Babylonian Talmud around the 5th century. However, the most popular version of this story comes from a 1933 play called Sheppy, which was written by an author named William Somerset Maugham. Since the tale is short, I'll just read it in its entirety. And for context, the speaker is death personified as a woman. There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to market to buy provisions, and in a little while the servant came back, white and trembling, and said, "Master, just now when I was in the marketplace I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when I turned I saw it was death that jostled me. She looked at me and made a threatening gesture. Now, lend me your horse, and I will ride away from this city and avoid my fate. I will go to Samara, and there death will not find me." The merchant lent him his horse, and the servant mounted it, and he dug his spurs in its flanks, and as fast as the horse could gallop, he went. Then the merchant went down to the marketplace, and he saw me standing in the crowd, and he came to me and said, 'Why did you make a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning?' 'That was not a threatening gesture,' I said. 'It was only a start of surprise. I was astonished to see him in Baghdad, for I had an appointment with him tonight in Samarra.'" Of course, the idea of the story being that one cannot outrun death. And as a matter of fact, it kind of has this menacing tone of predestination. The servant was always meant to die in Samarra, but he wouldn't have been there had he not tried to run from the inevitable. And here we have our character who is confronted by the organ player beneath the Iron Dragon, which also leads back to interesting symbols earlier in the story. Right before our character begins to mock the notion of setting in church, while he is looking at the church longingly, he says this: "The clear-cut, reasonable face of Monsieur C, his collected manner and easy, graceful gestures, were they not just a little discouraging to the notion of a gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head and almost laughed. That flyaway lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in a high wind, at the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would point her gold trumpet at him and puff him out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which at the time I thought very amusing." And from there is when he leads to say that the nun was more of a basilisk than the organ player. A basilisk is a monster often mentioned in old mythologies that is most often depicted as a giant serpent or sometimes a dragon. So while sitting in the church, he sees the visage of this angel above the pulpit and says if any kind of basilisk were to appear up there, the angel could simply point its trumpet at it and blow it away. But now in his attempt to run from the inevitable, there is no angel to save him from the iron dragon above his head as the organ player finally catches up to him. After the organ player reaches him, the story cuts and suddenly he's back in church. However, this time things are a little different. He notes that one of the women in church gives him a look of disapproval. He then realizes it's a sermon, and in reality, he had just fallen asleep in church. All that about the organ player chasing him down the streets and being beneath the Iron Dragon, that was just his dream while asleep during a service. He thinks to himself that the organ player was all in his head, until he glances up and sees the organ player walking with the rest of the crowd out of the church. And the story ends with these lines: "But I had escaped him, though his eyes had said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him the power over me came back out of oblivion, where I had hoped to keep it. For I knew him now. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he was come to do. And now I knew while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away, the arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, had changed him for every other eye but mine. And now I heard his voice, rising, swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the King in Yellow whispering to my soul, 'It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God.'" So he stands up from the church service, thinks everything is okay, but after he sees the organ player, everything disappears, and he is once again in the realm of the King in Yellow. He is at the lake of Hali, and he sees the towers of Carcosa behind the moon. Here it almost seems that Carcosa is an afterlife, that the realm of the King in Yellow is a sort of hell, or at least a hell that those who succumb to the King in Yellow are drawn into. He says that the organ player was changed from every face but his. Of course, this is from our author's perspective. Maybe the King in Yellow manipulated the organ player's image and the music he was playing as a method of terrorizing our protagonist. Or maybe our protagonist is right and the organ player was a vessel of the King in Yellow. simply disguised to everyone else. It seems that the King in Yellow kind of plays with his food too, right? Because he rug pulls him once by saying, oh, you were just sleeping through church. But then he does it again by showing that he is actually in the realm of the King in Yellow, or on the shores of Hali, as he says. In those last lines, the King in Yellow whispers to him it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. This is a phrase that is heard in a lot of churches, especially churches around the time. So the King in Yellow is manipulating religious iconography to describe himself as the living God. Of course, a God that our character has fallen into the hands of. The story seems to tie the King in Yellow to a lot of religious concepts, things like the devil and death. But what we see here in a literal sense as it relates to the King in Yellow mythos is that someone who was affected by the King in Yellow was terrorized by visions of the King in Yellow's servants or agents, so to speak. The pallid mask followed him and eventually caught him in his home, and now in the afterlife he has fully succumbed to the King in Yellow. Like I said, this is more of, I guess you could say, generic horror story in the sense that it's someone running from death. But there's still a bunch of really cool symbols to pick apart, things like the Iron Dragon and the Basilisk. And it's also interesting at the end to have him think that he survived the whole thing and it was just a dream, only for him to realize that the dream part was the dream. It's an interesting story and another example of the influence and inevitability of the King in Yellow. So with that, let's move into the final story from this book that we are going to cover today. And that story is The Yellow Sign. The Yellow Sign opens once again with a quote. This quote is from Bliss Carman's poem, Let the Red Dawn Surmise. The excerpt in The Yellow Sign reads, Let the red dawn surmise what we shall do when this blue starlight dies and all is through. Now, red dawns and blue stars sound very similar to Casilda's song or some of the other imagery we've seen associated with Carcosa. But in Bliss Carman's full poem, it continues after this and says, If we have loved but well under the sun, let the last morrow tell what we have done. So the poem is effectively saying, love while we can, we don't have forever. And similar to The Mask, this story seems to be a sort of romance. This story centers around a painter named Mr. Scott. Now, Mr. Scott is French and living in New York City around 1920. Or more explicitly, sometime after 1920, as we'll later find, this takes place in the same timeline as the first story, The Repair of Reputations. And it also seems that Mr. Scott is French. So, it's my headcanon, even though this isn't explicitly said, that Mr. Scott from this story is Jack Scott from The Mask. In The Yellow Sign, Mr. Scott is described as an older man who is a painter from France. And in The Mask, set in the 1890s, Jack Scott was a young painter from France. I do admit when some of the more supernatural instances happen in The Yellow Sign, it's odd that he never mentions, his three friends that went crazy because they read The King in Yellow, and then a woman turned to stone, but then turned to human again. So while it doesn't have to be the same guy, I choose to believe this is Jack Scott from The Mask. Mr. Scott has an apartment and studio that overlooks a church called St. Cecile. And immediately, Mr. Scott takes us right to the action. When I first saw the watchman, his back was toward me. I looked at him indifferently until he went into the church. I paid no more attention to him than I had to any other man who lounged through Washington Square that morning. And when I shut my window and turned back into my studio, I had forgotten him. Late in the afternoon, the day being warm, I raised the window again and leaned out to get a sniff of air. A man was standing in the courtyard of the church, and I noticed him again with as little interest as I had that morning. I looked across the square to where the fountain was playing, and then, with my mind filled with vague impressions of trees, asphalt drives, and the moving group of nursemaids and holidaymakers, I started to walk back to my easel. As I turned, my listless glance included the man below in the churchyard. His face was toward me now, and with a perfectly involuntary movement, I bent to see it. At the same moment, he raised his head and looked at me. Instantly, I thought of a coffin worm. Whatever it was about the man that repelled me, I did not know, but the impression of a plump white grave worm was so intense and nauseating that I must have shown it in my expression, for he turned his puffy face away with a movement which made me think of a disturbed grub in a chestnut. We are already seeing a lot of similarities to In the Court of the Dragon. In that story, a man was in church and became haunted by a white-faced man from within the church, and here we have someone who lives next to a church and is haunted by a white-faced man who stands outside of the church. So off the bat, from what we've learned from previous stories, we can assume this pale-faced man who disturbs Mr. Scott must be an agent of the King in Yellow, as he is once again bearing the pallid mask. But as we're going to find out, unlike in the Court of the Dragon, Mr. Scott hasn't come across the King in Yellow yet. Unless, of course, my theory's right, and this is the same Jack Scott from The Mask, in which case he did come across the effects of it even if he never read the play. Regardless, it seems the entities of the King in Yellow are already haunting him, even if he hasn't done anything to cause it yet. This also makes In the Court of the Dragon the odd man out, as even if this Mr. Scott isn't Jack Scott, he later says in the story that he heard about what happened to Hildred Castaigne. So that ties this story to the Repair of Reputations, and the Repair of Reputations was tied to The Mask because Boris's fates were mentioned in the Repair of Reputations. And if I'm right about Jack Scott, all three of them connect in a circle. So the only one that isn't touched is In the Court of the Dragon. Not that it matters that much, but it might be part of the reason that our protagonist was never named in that story, as it's just an example of someone being haunted and killed by the King in Yellow, and that story was more so just about the inevitability of the king rather than characters who are thrown off by the king's influence, as we never even had time to know the protagonist of that story before he was affected by the play. Anyway, back to the yellow sign. As mentioned, Mr. Scott is a painter and he's working with a nude model named Tessie. He keeps making progress on his painting and then undoing it because he doesn't like the way the colors are coming out. He describes the colors he's making as unhealthy and sickly. We see a cute interaction between the two as Mr. Scott is getting frustrated when she says, "Is it something I've done?" "No, I've made a mess of this arm, and for the life of me, I can't see how I came to paint such mud as that into the canvas," I replied. "Don't I pose well?" she insisted. "Of course, perfectly." "Then it's not my fault?" "No, it's my own." "I'm very sorry," she said. Mr. Scott continues to scrub turpentine and try to fix the color of the image, but as he tries to fix it, it just gets worse. He describes it as an infection that starts in one place and then spreads over the rest of the painting. He eventually has Tessie come over to look at it, and she says, "What have you been doing to it?" "Nothing," I growled. "It must be this turpentine." "What a horrible color it is now," she continued. "Do you think my flesh resembles green cheese?" "No, I don't," I said angrily. "Did you ever know me to paint like that before?" "No, indeed." "Well, then, it must be the turpentine, or something," she admitted. Mr. Scott continues to work on the painting, and it just gets worse until eventually he gets frustrated and throws his brushes through the canvas. Tessie scolds him for acting out of rage, and then while she's getting dressed, says, "Everything went wrong from the time you came back from the window and talked about that horrid-looking man you saw in the churchyard." So after observing the pale-faced man in the courtyard, the painting itself became infected with a sickly color. Mr. Scott looks out the window and sees the man standing outside still. Tessie comes to look and says that he reminds her of the man she saw in her dream. Mr. Scott pokes fun at her for this before she says that Mr. Scott was in that dream as well. Tessie leaned back on the open windowsill and began very seriously. "One night last winter, I was lying in bed thinking about nothing at all in particular. I had been posing for you and I was tired out, yet it seemed impossible for me to sleep. I heard the bells in the city ring, 10, 11, and midnight. I must have fallen asleep about midnight because I don't remember hearing the bells after that. It seemed to me that I had scarcely closed my eyes when I dreamed that something impelled me to go to the window. I rose and raising the sash leaned out. 25th Street was deserted as far as I could see. I began to be afraid. Everything outside seemed so black and uncomfortable. Then the sound of wheels in the distance came to my ears, and it seemed to me as though that was what I must wait for. Very slowly the wheels approached, and finally I could make out a vehicle moving along the street. It came nearer and nearer, and when it passed beneath my window, I saw it was a hearse. Then, as I trembled with fear, the driver turned and looked straight at me. When I awoke, I was standing by the open window shivering with cold, but the black-plumed hearse and the driver were gone. I dreamed this dream again in March last, and again awoke beside the open window. Last night the dream came again. You remember how it was raining? When I awoke, standing at the open window, my night dress was soaked. But where did I come into the dream? I asked. You were in the coffin, but you were not dead. In the coffin? Yes. How did you know? Could you see me? No, I only knew you were there. Had you been eating Welsh rarebits or lobster salad? I began laughing, but the girl interrupted me with a frightened cry. Hello? What's up? I said as she shrank into the embrasure by the window. The man below in the churchyard, he drove the hearse. Nonsense, I said. But Tessie's eyes were wide with terror. I went to the window and looked out. The man was gone. Come, Tessie, I urged. Don't be foolish. You have posed too long. You are nervous. Do you think I could forget that face? She murmured. 3 times I saw the hearse pass below my window, and every time the driver turned and looked up at me. Oh, his face was so white and soft. It looked dead. It looked as if it had been dead a long time. I induced the girl to sit down and swallow a glass of marsala. Then I sat down beside her, try to give her some advice. So Tessie has this recurring nightmare of a hearse passing beneath her window being driven by the watchman in front of the church with Mr. Scott lying alive in the back of it. She's had this dream 3 times, and it seems each time she is sleepwalking to the window and leaning out. Last night she did it and allowed herself to get soaked in the rain, but continued to dream regardless. This story keeps a consistent tone of inevitability. It's like the things that are happening to these characters were predestined for them, and they're simply passengers to what's going to happen, just as Mr. Scott in Tessie's dream is a live passenger in the back of the hearse, unable to stop his own funeral. Mr. Scott tries to tell Tessie that she's just getting worked up over nothing. He describes what she has as a soft-shell crab dream, which is very funny. I've probably had some crabs in my time that were bad enough to see a few hearses. The next day, the bellboy, Thomas, comes to Mr. Scott to bring him the paper. Thomas also says that the Catholic church right outside has just been sold. Mr. Scott is grateful for this, not because he doesn't like the church, he just didn't like the people in this specific church. His reasonings for not liking the people in the church are kind of funny. He says, "My nerves were shattered by a blatant exhorter whose every word echoed through the aisle of the church as if it had been my own rooms, and who insisted on his R's with a nasal persistence which revolted my every instinct." He then says this, "Then too there was a fiend in human shape, an organist who reeled off some of the grand old hymns with an interpretation of his own, and I longed for the blood of a creature who could play the doxology with an amendment of minor chords which one hears only in a quartet of very young undergraduates." So he's saying there was an organist that was so bad at playing the organ that he wished they could just have some undergraduates come in and play more simply so that he doesn't have to hear that guy anymore. Now, you could draw similarities between a fiend in human shape who plays an organ at a Catholic church. I think that's mostly just a reference, and in this story, Mr. Scott just doesn't like the way the guy plays the organ. And then after that, he says, "I believe the minister was a good man, but when he bellowed, 'And the Lord said unto Moses, the Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. My wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword,' I wondered how many centuries of purgatory it would take to atone for such a sin." Like, he could hear the minister in there, and he spoke in such an annoying way that Mr. Scott was like, 500 years? It can't be that bad. Thomas and Mr. Scott continue to talk, and the following interaction takes place. I walked to the window. The young man with the unhealthy face stood by the churchyard gate, and at the mere sight of him, the same overwhelming repugnance took possession of me. "By the way, Thomas," I said, "who is that fellow down there?" Thomas sniffed. "That there worm, sir? Is night watchman of the church, sir. He makes me tired of sitting out all night on them steps and looking at you insulting like. I'd have punched his head, sir. Beg pardon, sir. Go on, Thomas." "One night, coming home with Harry, the other English boy, I sees him a-sitting there on them steps. We had Molly and Jen with us, sir, the 2 girls on the tray service, and, he looks so insulting at us that I up and says, 'What are you looking at, you fat slug?' Beg pardon, sir, but that's how I says it, sir. Then he don't say nothing, and I says, 'Come out and I'll punch that puddin' head.' Then I opens the gates and goes in, but he don't say nothing, only looks insulting like. Then I hits him in one, but his head was that cold and mushy it'd sicken you to touch him." "What did he do then?" I asked curiously. "Him? Nothing. And you, Thomas?" The young fellow flushed with embarrassment and smiled uneasily. "Mr. Scott, sir, I ain't no coward, and I can't make it out all why I run. I was in the 5th Lancer, sir, bugler at Tel El Kabar, and was shot at by the Wells." "You don't mean to say you ran away?" "Yes, sir, I run." "Why?" "That's just what I want to know, sir. I grabbed Molly and run, and the rest was as frightened as I." "But What were they frightened at? Thomas refused to answer for a while, but now my curiosity was aroused above the repulsive young man below, and I pressed him. 3 years' sojourn in America had not only modified Thomas's Cockney dialect, but had given him the American's fear of ridicule. You won't believe me, Mr. Scott, sir. Yes, I will. You'll laugh at me, sir. Nonsense. He hesitated. Well, sir, it's God's truth that when I hit him, he grabbed me wrist, sir, and when I twisted his soft, mushy fist, one of his fingers come off in me hand. The utter loathing and horror of Thomas's face must have been reflected in my own, for he added, It's horrible, and now, when I see him, I just go away. He makes me ill. When Thomas had gone, I went to the window. The man stood beside the church railing with both hands on the gate, but I hastily retreated to my easel again, sickened and horrified, for I saw that the middle finger of his right hand was missing. So one night, Thomas, with some ladies, decides he doesn't like the way this night watchman is looking at him, goes up and punches him, but his head was soft and mushy, and when Thomas rips his fist away from his hand, the guy's middle finger comes with it. It's like the guy is just a bag of bones and skin that loiters around the front of the church. Now, thankfully, unlike the organ player in the last story, it seems that more people than just Mr. Scott and Tessie can see him. But that doesn't exactly quell the fear of the decomposing person who is standing in front of the now vacant church. Tessie comes over and Mr. Scott begins painting a new picture. And as Tessie is describing the night after she left Mr. Scott's yesterday, she says her and her friends went out on the town and that she made a mash. That is old school slang for flirted with a guy or went out on a date. In some circles, it means a hookup, but I really don't think that's what it's implying here. Mr. Scott shows that he cares for Tessie and tries to give her some advice to be safe whenever she is flirting or talking to new guys, and Tessie assures him that this guy is a gentleman. Things seem to be growing great, and Mr. Scott and Tessie remark that today's painting looks much better. While speaking about Tessie, Mr. Scott says, she and I never discussed morals at all, and I had no intention of doing so. Partly because I had none myself, and partly because I knew she would do what she liked in spite of me. Still, I did hope she would steer clear of complications, because I wished her well, and then also I had a selfish desire to retain the best model I had. I knew that mashing, as she termed it, had no significance with girls like Tessie, and that such things in America did not resemble in the least the same things in Paris. Potentially a reference to the dating and flirting versus hookup meaning of the term. Yet, having lived with my eyes open, I also knew that somebody would take Tessie away someday, in one manner or another, and though I professed to myself that marriage was nonsense, I sincerely hoped that, in this case, there would be a priest at the end of the vista. Priest at the end of the vista, keep that in mind for later. So it seems that Mr. Scott has feelings for Tessie, but perhaps because he's older than her, perhaps because he just assumes that she has a different way of life, that she's interested in guys that aren't him, he doesn't say anything. He even later goes on to say that he just wants her to be happy, whatever that means. But then while thinking this to himself, he begins to speak to Tessie and says this. Do you know that I also had a dream last night? I observed. Not about that man, she laughed. Exactly. A dream similar to yours, only much worse. It was foolish and thoughtless of me to say this, but you know how little tact the average painter has. I must have fallen asleep about 10 o'clock, I continued, and after a while I dreamt that I awoke. So plainly did I hear the midnight bells, the wind in the tree branches, and the whistle of steamers from the bay, that even now I can scarcely believe I was not awake. I seemed to be lying in a box which had a glass cover. Dimly I saw the street lamps as I passed, for I must tell you, Tessie, the box in which I reclined appeared to lie in a cushioned wagon which jolted me over a stony pavement. After a while I became impatient and tried to move, but the box was too narrow. My hands were crossed on my breast, so I could not raise them to help myself. I listened and then tried to call. My voice was gone. I could hear the trample of the horses attached to the wagon and even the breathing of the driver. Then another sound broke upon my ears like the raising of a window sash. I managed to turn my head a little and found I could look not only through the glass cover of my box, but also through the glass panes in the side of the covered vehicle. I saw houses, empty and silent, with neither light nor life about any of them, excepting one. In that house, a window was open on the first floor, and a figure all in white stood looking down into the street. It was you. Tessie had turned her face away from me and leaned on the table with her elbow. I could see your face, I resumed, and it seemed to me to be very sorrowful. Then we passed on and turned into a narrow black lane. Presently the horses stopped. I waited and waited, closing my eyes with fear and impatience, but all was silent as the grave. After what seemed to me hours, I began to feel uncomfortable. A sense that somebody was close to me made me unclose my eyes. Then I saw the white face of the hearse driver looking at me through the coffin lid. A sob from Tessie interrupted me. She was trembling like a leaf. I saw I had made an ass of myself and attempted to repair the damage. "Why, Tess," I said, "I only told you this to show you what influence your story might have on another person's dreams. You don't suppose I really lay in a coffin, do you? What are you trembling for? Don't you see that your dream and my unreasonable dislike for that inoffensive watchman of the church simply set my brain working as soon as I fell asleep?" So it is the same dream that Tessie had, only from the perspective of Mr. Scott lying in the coffin. It seems that whatever path Tessie was previously on, by speaking it aloud, she has dragged Mr. Scott into his place within the story. Tessie continues to cry and Mr. Scott comforts her. Eventually, he asks what she's so afraid of, assuring her that these dreams are simply dreams. Tessie says that she worries for Mr. Scott, and then it says she murmured in a voice almost inaudible, I care for you. At first I started to laugh, but when I understood her, a shock passed through me, and I sat like one turned to stone. This was the crowning bit of idiocy I had committed. During the moment which elapsed between her reply and my answer, I thought of 1,000 responses to that innocent confession. I could pass it by with a laugh, I could misunderstand her and assure her as to my health. I could simply point out that it was impossible she could love me. But my reply was quicker than my thoughts, and I might think now when it was too late, for I'd kissed her on the mouth. So after Tessie confesses his love for him, Mr. Scott no longer hides his feelings for her. After this, Tessie goes home, and Mr. Scott thinks about how he will no longer deny himself the love of Tessie. He does say one interesting point of note. So at the beginning of the story, in the opening paragraph, there's a line that says, Sylvia bent, half curiously, half tenderly, over a small green lizard, murmuring, to think that this also is a little ward of God. So we have a woman named Silva looking compassionately at a small lizard. And then in the paragraph where he is thinking to himself of how he cares for Tessie, but should let her be with a man who is more her speed or her age, he says, a man who lives as much alone as I do must confess to somebody. Then again, Sylvia was Catholic, and it was reason enough for me. But I was speaking of Tessie, which is very different. So it seems at some point, this Sylvia character that he referred to at the beginning of the story was a woman he once loved. But here, as he's walking outside thinking about how him and Tessie kissed earlier, he says, there was no back out now, and I stared the future straight in the face. I was not good, not even scrupulous, but I had no idea of deceiving either myself or Tessie. The one passion of my life lay buried in the sunlit forest of Brittany. Was it buried forever? Hope cried, no. For 3 years I had been listening to the voice of hope, and for 3 years I had waited for a footstep on my threshold. Had Sylvia forgotten? No, cried Hope. So you could take this to mean quite literally Sylvia was a woman he loved, perhaps his wife, that died and is buried in a forest in Brittany. But I think given that line, for 3 years I had been listening to the voice of hope, and I had waited for a footstep on my threshold, had Sylvia forgotten. I think Sylvia was a woman that he had a fling with, that for several years he waited on her to come back, but she never did. So now he's conflicted because although he loves Tessie, he doesn't know if that means giving up on a love he once had. And while thinking to himself that he isn't deserving of love, he says, in one thing alone, except my painting, was I serious. And that was something which lay hidden, if not lost, in the Breton forest. Again, another mention of this lost love, lost in the forest. I interpret this to mean that he had a love for a woman named Sylvia, who he had lost in a forest. Something that may have a connection later on in this book, not something we're going to cover today, but if you read it for yourself, a thing to keep in mind. He has a whole debate with himself, saying that he's unworthy of love, that Tessie deserves better, but eventually he decides to give love a chance. I mean, as the poem that opened up this story suggested, love while you can, right? We don't know how long we have. Later that night, as he's making his way home, the following takes place. There was not a soul in the park as I passed along the trees and took the walk which leads from the Garibaldi statue to the Hamilton apartment house. But as I passed the churchyard, I saw a figure sitting on the stone steps. In spite of myself, a chill crept over me at the sight of the white, puffy face, and I hastened to pass. Then he said something which might have been addressed to me or might merely have been a mutter to himself. But a sudden furious anger flamed up within me that such a creature should address me. For an instant I felt like wheeling about and smashing my stick over his head, but I walked on, and entering the Hamilton, went to my apartment. For some time I tossed about the bed trying to get the sound of his voice out of my ears, but could not. It filled my head, that muttering sound, like thick oily smoke from a fat-rendering vat or an odor of noisome decay. And as I lay and tossed about, the voice in my ears seemed more distinct, and I began to understand the words he had muttered. They came to me slowly, as if I had forgotten them. And at last I could make some sense of the sounds. It was this: "Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign?" I was furious. What did he mean by that? Then with a curse upon him and his, I rolled over and went to sleep. But when I awoke later, I looked pale and haggard, for I had dreamed the dream of the night before, and it troubled me more than I cared to think. So as Mr. Scott passed the night watchman, he heard the watchman say, "Have you found the yellow sign?" The yellow sign gives us another tie back to the repair of reputations. Again, the yellow sign was the symbol on the cape that Hildred wore. We can assume the yellow sign to be a symbol that denotes the king in yellow. Quite literally, the king's visage or seal. But Mr. Scott hasn't seen the yellow sign yet. He hasn't even come across the book, The King in Yellow. Again, my theory is that he's Jack Scott from The Mask, but in that story, if I am right, he never even read The King in Yellow. But in spite of that, he is being haunted by the pale-faced man, the pallid mask, and being told to find the yellow sign. And of course, the dreams he keeps having, and the dream he had that night of him lying in the back of a hearse. Again, even though he hasn't touched the play yet, it seems the King in Yellow knows he will. The next day, Tessie comes in and she's super affectionate. She gives Mr. Scott a kiss and he gives her one back. But when she goes to take her clothes off to pose nude, as she always does, she freezes. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Don't you feel well?" "Yes." "Then hurry." "Do you want me to pose as I've always posed?" Then I understood. Here was a new complication. I had lost, of course, the best nude model I had ever seen. I looked at Tessie. Her face was scarlet. Alas, alas, we had eaten of the tree of knowledge, and Eden and native innocence were dreams of the past. I mean, for her. I suppose she noticed the disappointment on my face, for she said, "I will pose if you wish. The study is behind the screen here where I put it." "No," I said, "we will begin something new." And I went into my wardrobe and picked out a Moorish costume, which fairly blazed with tinsel. It's kind of funny that earlier in the story, he spoke of how eventually he's going to lose Tessie as a new model because she's going to marry a man and they'll probably move off, or she just won't want to pose naked anymore. But now, funny enough, in Mr. Scott being the man who has stolen her away, he has now, in a sense, lost his nude model. Because before it was purely transactional. It was like a doctor's appointment. Take your clothes off so I can paint the end. But now that they have feelings for each other, it's like, oh, you want me to be naked? Also, that brief little mention of Eden and eating of the tree and innocence and stuff like that are themes that will show up in later short stories within the book. It's also cute that she didn't want to outright say that she didn't want to pose naked, but she hid the painting he was working on so that hopefully she would have time to change his mind. So she puts on clothes and they go about painting as normal and everything's great. Two lovebirds in love. I'm sure nothing bad will happen to them in this horror story. At a break in their painting, Mr. Scott reaches into his pocket and pulls out a gold necklace he's bought for her. She then runs into another room and shows that she bought a gift for him as well. Aw, they are so disgustingly cute. Let's see what she got him. I opened the box. On the pink cotton inside lay a clasp of black onyx, on which was inlaid a curious symbol or letter in gold. Dang it. Immediately, as soon as it's like happy and, there's rainbows and there's birds chirping and stuff like that, boom, yellow sign. It was neither Arabic nor Chinese, nor, as I found afterwards, did it belong to any human script. Mr. Scott says that this piece of onyx with the yellow symbol looks beautiful. In fact, he's annoyed that she would spend that much money on him. "How foolish, Tess, to go and buy me such a beautiful thing as this," I said. "I did not buy it," she laughed. "Where did you get it?" Then she told me how she found it one day while coming home from the aquarium in the Battery, how she had advertised it and watched the papers, but at last gave up all hopes of finding the owner. "That was last winter," she said, "the very day I had the first horrid dream about the hearse. And now this starts to make sense. The reason she started having those dreams and the reason she eventually looped Mr. Scott into it is because she was the first to come across the yellow sign, even though she had no idea what it meant. And perhaps that set into the series of events that caused the night watchman to set outside of the church and last night tell Mr. Scott, "Have you seen the yellow sign?" A sign he would see the next day. The next day, Mr. Scott says he was moving a painting in the morning when he fell and sprained his wrist. He sprained it to such a degree that he wasn't able to paint, so Tessie just decided to stay in the studio with him. It was also raining heavily outside, so there was no way for either of them to go out for a walk or go to a restaurant. So they're simply sitting inside of the studio, bored. I had read all the papers and all the books in the library, but for the sake of something to do, I went to the bookcases and shoved them open with my elbow. I knew every volume by its color and examined them all, passing slowly around the library and whistling to keep up my spirits. I was turning to go into the dining room when my eye fell upon a book bound in serpent skin, standing in a corner of the top shelf of the last bookcase. I did not remember it. From the floor could not decipher the pale lettering on the back. So I went to the smoking room and called Tessie. She came in from the studio and climbed up to reach the book. "What is it?" I asked. "The King in Yellow." They were so cute. Again, he knew every book in that bookcase. How did the King in Yellow get there? Maybe the watchman broke in at night and put it in there. Maybe supernaturally at some point in the past it worked its way into a stack of books that he bought and he simply didn't recognize it until now, until it was time for him to recognize it. I was dumbfounded. Who had placed it there? How came it in my rooms? I had long ago decided that I should never open that book, and nothing on earth could have persuaded me to buy it. Fearful lest curiosity might tempt me to open it, I had never even looked at it in bookstores. If I ever had any curiosity to read it, the awful tragedy of young Castaigne, whom I knew, prevented me from exploring its wicked pages. I'd always refused to listen to any description of it, and indeed, nobody ever ventured to discuss the second part aloud, so I had absolutely no knowledge of what those leaves might reveal. I stared at the poisonous, mottled binding as I would at a snake. So again, this is our confirmation that Mr. Scott knows about Castaigne's story from the Repair of Reputations. I guess after what happened to Castaigne, it became a big story around the area, or at least big enough for people like Hawberk and Lewis to tell others. And this gives more credibility to what Hildred said in the Repair of Reputations, that the book had become infamous for the effects it has on people's minds. However, it seems Tessie hasn't heard these stories, because when Mr. Scott tells her to put the book down, it says, "Of course my admonition was enough to arouse her curiosity. Before I could prevent it, she took the book and, laughing, danced off into the studio with it. I called to her, but she slipped away with a tormenting smile at my helpless hands, and I followed her with some impatience. 'Tessie,' I cried, entering the library. 'Listen, I am serious. Put the book away. I do not wish you to open it.' The library was empty. I went into both drawing rooms, then into the bedrooms, laundry, kitchen, and finally returned to the library and began a systematic search. She had hidden herself so well that it was half an hour later when I discovered her crouching white and silent by the lattice window in the storeroom above. At first glance, I saw she had been punished for her foolishness. The King in Yellow lay at her feet, but the book was open at the second part. I looked at Tessie and saw it was too late. She had opened The King in Yellow. Then I took her by the hand and led her into the studio. She seemed dazed, and when I told her to lie down on the sofa, she obeyed me without a word. So Tessie, not knowing this cosmic game she had taken part in, the same game she had taken part in when she found the onyx with the yellow sign, read The King in Yellow for half an hour, and when he finds her, just as everyone else who becomes affected by the book, she has a scared white face. Then taking her to the sofa, she seems to be in a trance. Now what I like here is a little bit of symbolism within the story. Earlier, he mentions Tessie as Eve in the Garden of Eden, Eve who ate of the fruit of knowledge and was cursed by it. And here again, Tessie has taken of a knowledge she was not supposed to know, and it seems she's suffering the consequences of it. But just as Adam saw what Eve went through and couldn't let her go there alone, it seems Mr. Scott feels the same way. For a long while I sat silently beside her, but she neither stirred nor spoke. And at last I rose, and entering the unused storeroom, took the book in my least injured hand. It seemed heavy as lead, but I carried it into the studio again, and sitting down on the rug beside the sofa, opened it and read it through from beginning to end. Adam also ate of the tree of knowledge, and it seems here Mr. Scott has done the same. When faint with excess of my emotions, I dropped the volume and leaned wearily back against the sofa. Tessie opened her eyes and looked at me. So Tessie, who had read The King in Yellow, went into a trance, and she was catatonic until Mr. Scott fulfilled his part in the story and read the book as well. This is just like how back in The Mask, Genevieve was catatonic until the time came for her to tell Boris that she loved Alec in front of both of them. And then as soon as Alec was sick and put away, that then became time for Boris to carve his face into the statue and then for Genevieve to throw herself into the pool, which led to Boris's death. The King in Yellow is using people like puppets, hurting them in order to make the others do his bidding. I believe Tessie might have laid there in a coma forever until Mr. Scott decided to read the book, at which point the King in Yellow got what he wants, and now they are ready to carry on the rest of his plan. We had been speaking for some time in a dull, monotonous strain before I realized that we were discussing The King in Yellow. Oh, the sin of writing such words, words which are clear as crystal, limpid and musical as bubbling springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisoned diamonds of the Medicis. Oh, the wickedness, the hopeless damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyze human creatures with such words, words understood by the ignorant and wise alike, words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than music, more awful than death. We talked on, unmindful of the gathering shadows, and she was begging me to throw away the clasp of black onyx quaintly inlaid with what we now knew to be the yellow sign. I never shall know why I refused, though even at this hour, here in my bedroom as I write this confession, I should be glad to know what it was that prevented me from tearing the yellow sign from my breast and casting it into the fire. I am sure I wished to do so, and yet Tessie pleaded with me in vain. Night fell and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the king and the pallid mask, and midnight sounded from the misty spires in the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hastur and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the black window panes as the cloud waves roll and break on the shores of Hali. Tessie might be breaking through to some degree. Maybe her love for Mr. Scott is convincing her to tell him to throw away the yellow sign. But Mr. Scott hasn't broke through yet. He's still under the king's trance. I mean, everything he's saying, he's describing the fog outside and comparing it to the shores of Hali. It seems that he is truly, firmly under the king's grasp. The house was very silent now, and not a sound came up from the misty streets. Tessie lay among the cushions, her face a gray blot in the gloom, but her hands were clasped in mine, and I knew that she knew and read my thoughts as I read hers, for we had understood the mystery of the Hyades, and the phantom of truth was laid. Then, as we answered each other, swiftly, silently, thought on thought, the shadows stirred in the gloom about us, and far in the distant streets we heard a sound. Nearer and nearer it came, the dull crunching of wheels, nearer and yet nearer, and now outside before the door it ceased, and I dragged myself to the window and saw a black-plumed hearse. The gate below opened and shut, and I crept shaking to my door and bolted it, but I knew no bolts, no locks could keep the creature out who was coming for the yellow sign. And now I heard him moving very softly along the hall. Now he was at the door, and the bolts rotted at his touch. Now he had entered, with eyes starting from my head, and I peered into the darkness. But when he came into the room, I did not see him. It was only when I felt him envelop me in his cold, soft grasp that I cried out and struggled with deadly fury, but my hands were useless, and he tore the onyx clasp from my coat and struck me full in the face. Then, as I fell, I heard Tessie's soft cry, and her spirit fled. And even while falling, I longed to follow her, for I knew that the King in Yellow had opened his tattered mantle, and there was only God to cry to now. It had been several months since she found the yellow sign, and only through a love which the King in Yellow manipulated did she give that sign to Mr. Scott, dooming both of them. And all it took was for them to read the book, and their fate had been sealed, and that night in the fog, the hearse came for them. In those last couple sentences, Tessie died. Mr. Scott was struck by the watchman, but it says that Tessie's spirit left her. Both of them were set on this path from the time this story began. It was just a matter of time before they found the serpent-skinned book hiding in the library. The yellow sign ends with these words: "I could tell more, but I cannot see what help it will be to the world. As for me, I am past human help or hope. As I lie here, writing, careless even whether or not I die before I finish, I can see the doctor gathering up his powders and phials with a vague gesture to the good priest beside me, which I understand. They will be very curious to know the tragedy. They of the outside world who write books and print millions of newspapers, but I shall write no more. And the Father Confessor will seal my last words with the seal of sanctity when his holy office is done. They of the outside world may send their creatures into wrecked homes and death-smitten firesides, and their newspapers will batten on blood and tears, but with me their spies must halt before the confessional. They know that Tessie is dead and that I am dying. They know how the people in the house, aroused by an infernal scream, rushed into my room and found 1 living and 2 dead. But they do not know what I shall tell them now. They do not know that the doctor said, as he pointed to the horrible decomposed heap on the floor, the livid corpse of the watchman from the church, I have no theory, no explanation. That man must have been dead for months. I think I am dying. I wish the priest would, and the story ends. So the reason the watchman looked like a giant grub, the reason his head was soft and mushy, and the reason Thomas ripped off one of his fingers by pulling his fist back, is because the watchman was effectively a rotting corpse. Dead for months, the doctor said. Perhaps dead from the moment that Tessie found the yellow sign. It's very possible that the rest of the world thinks that Mr. Scott was responsible for the murder of the watchman and the murder of Tessie. But regardless, it seems he dies in the final pages of the story as well. Earlier in the story, he said that he wished his tenure with Tessie would end with a priest, and he was right. There was a priest by his bedside when he died. Again, he was calling out his own inevitabilities, even if he didn't know it, just as Tessie did when she picked up the onyx stone she found on the street outside. This story has a particular nihilistic tone to it, doesn't it? I mean, in the other stories, except for in the Court of the Dragon, but again, our character in that story didn't seem super important or detailed. But in the other 2 stories, the characters had a way out. There was a humanity that surpassed the influence of the King in Yellow. Or there were characters like Lewis and Constance who were able to stay out of it. But here we have 2 characters who, before the story began, already had their fate set in stone. They already had the visions of the hearse that was going to get them, and she had already found the yellow sign. Perhaps there was a scenario that, in spite of the King in Yellow being inevitable, they had some control over when it would happen. I mean, the only reason that he read the King in Yellow is because he hurt his hands and decided to lazily look through his library where he came across it. Perhaps, as symbolized in the Court of the Dragon, similar to death, the King in Yellow is an inevitability. It's just a matter of when it is to happen. But regardless, that inevitability came for them in the end. I also like to mention when Mr. Scott realizes what's happening, he goes to the door and locks it shut. But then it kind of describes that the lock decays off and the watchman simply passes through the doorway. We get these recurring themes involving the King in Yellow of disease, of sickliness. And it seems that rot spreads to the very world around him. The watchman simply approaches the door and the lock rots off. Or I mean the watchman himself being a rotting carcass that is upright and speaking like a man, if garbled and distorted. And again, anyone who's affected by the King in Yellow becomes sickly and pale. It's like the King in Yellow is the essence of rot or disease. And you can kind of take that idea and push it onto the whole. Everywhere the King in Yellow goes, it's the rot of the human condition or diseases of evil in the world. It's pushing people to horrific alchemy and forbidden love. It's pushing people to visions of grandeur and violence. And in our last 2 stories, it literally pushes people to their death. Sometimes there are stories about it, sometimes it simply gets in the way. Regardless of how it happens, the King in Yellow is always there. Now, after the yellow sign, there are 6 more stories within the anthology book, but we're not going to talk about those today. That's because these first 4 stories are the only one that explicitly mentions the King in Yellow. And while in the 6 other stories there are certainly themes and ideas that tie back to the greater idea of the King in Yellow, the King in Yellow and the play and its influence are not explicitly mentioned. And again, I want to keep this video about the mythos around the king itself. If you're interested in learning about those 6 other stories, then of course you can always read the book for yourself. There's several copies of it available for free online as well. Or you can check out a YouTube video by fellow YouTuber Flaw Peacock. Peacock has done an incredible job going through every story in The King in Yellow, talking about a lot of the different themes and characters and ideas. And he goes through the 6 stories that I'm not covering today. And that full video is 7.5 hours, I believe. So a ton of cool information to dig into. So if you're interested in that, I'll have a link to it in the description. Can't recommend it enough. But these first 4 stories are the mythos that we get around the play The King in Yellow. Again, a play that doesn't actually exist but has so much influence in the stories we just read. We see glimpses of the play, characters like Camilla and Casilda. We hear about the Lake of Hali, we hear about the towers of Carcosa that can be seen behind the moon. Sometimes it's described as a place far from Earth. Other times it's described as a primordial ruin that came long before us. Sometimes it's described as the place that awaits us when we die. It's like The King in Yellow embodies the very essence of the unknown, of the id, of the thing in the closet, the monster we don't want to look at. Concepts of death, disease, eternity. All of them are kind of encapsulated in this mythical king and this mythical land we can only hope to understand and we only see glimpses of even now. Regardless if you view the King in Yellow as a sort of eldritch god, as this ancient being that controls the reality we live within, or if you just see the King in Yellow as the essence, the symbolism of evil, of bad, of the unknown, either way, the King in Yellow is all about inevitability. And the horror of it comes from our inability to do anything about it. I mean, if the King in Yellow is a being that was here before the earth even existed, that has these lost ancient cities of towers that go over the moon, and all of that was turned to ash and rot, and the King in Yellow still exists, then how could we ever hope to go up against him? Or if the king is simply the embodiment of death, disease, and evil, well, how can we hope to go up against that? The first story we read was about someone completely consumed by the idea, the grandeur, the temptation of the King in Yellow, but our other stories were people who were just living their life, and then the King in Yellow stepped in. And in every case, especially the last one, it seems that everything that happened to them was predetermined. The symbolism of the fate statues coming up again and again is reference of that. The idea that our birth, life, and death was all decided for us from the beginning. The idea that free will, choice, is just a hopeful dream, a dream for fools. It's a fear that is incredibly common, a fear that is seen across religions, beliefs, and cultures throughout history. And I think it's because of that, the King in Yellow idea has resonated with so many artists. Because even if you've never read The King in Yellow, even if you've never heard of it before I've talked about it today, I guarantee you know something that is inspired or directly related to it. So why don't we talk about a few of those? Now, it wouldn't be right to talk about things that took influence from The King in Yellow without talking about where the influence from The King in Yellow itself came from. Ambrose Bierce was an early American horror writer who wrote most of his famous stories beginning around the 1880s. One of these stories is called An Inhabitant of Carcosa. It's a short little 3-page story, but the gist of it is that someone is exploring a long-forgotten city known as Carcosa. We get a lot of other name drops in An Inhabitant in Carcosa as well, as Ambrose also mentions things like Hali, and he mentions seeing Aldebaran and the Hyades, formations in the night sky. And the short story ends with the protagonist finding his own gravestone in the remnants of Carcosa, only to realize he's a ghost that didn't yet realize he was dead. So not only do you get some name drops, but you get some idea of inevitability, of a predestined death that people can't escape from. Of course, Chambers took these names and created the Forgotten Play and the King in Yellow, and mostly used the nomenclature from Ambrose's story to create his narrative. But again, there is some tie between the inevitability of death between both. Ambrose himself is an interesting author, not only in his writing, but also in his life, as not only did the guy serve in the Civil War, but he also never officially died, as he simply vanished off the face of the earth. Chambers then read An Inhabitant of Carcosa, adapted a lot of the language into his story, and from other of Ambrose's work, adapted words like Hastur. However, where names like Hastur and Hali and stuff like that is much more well known, culturally at least, is within H.P. Lovecraft's work. H.P. Lovecraft read The King in Yellow and was very impressed by it. So impressed, in fact, that he incorporated things like the Lake of Hali, the Yellow Sign, and Hastur into his 1931 story, The Whisperer in Darkness, which is one of the main stories that tie into the Cthulhu mythos. So because of that, as Lovecraft and Cthulhu became super popular within occult horror circles, names from The King in Yellow became popular as well. Other adaptations that would build off of Lovecraft's work would try to put more meat to the King in Yellow idea. Most would kind of blend the idea of Hastur as either being the name of the King in Yellow or being a figure that the King in Yellow inhabits. Because of that, in a lot of Lovecraft-related stories, the King in Yellow is an explicitly eldritch being that existed before the Earth was formed, similar to Cthulhu. And while I think that adaptation is certainly interesting and there's a lot of meat there, I feel like The King in Yellow loses something when you pin it down. I think the concept is much more terrifying if the King in Yellow inhabits sickness or death or the essence of evil in the world. I feel like if you get too hung up on what the figure looks like or what the figure can do, it loses a bit of its value. But at the same time, it's pretty cool, and a lot of people have done cool things with it, incorporating characters like the King in Yellow into a lot of the Call of Cthulhu, like RPG tabletop games. Or when talking about the old gods of Lovecraft mythos, Hastur or the King will often show up. And because of its relation to Lovecraft, the names began to spread everywhere. There are too many examples to name here, but just to throw a few out. The King in Yellow is a character within some of the Warhammer 40k novels. The King in Yellow becomes a character in Grant Morris's graphic novel, The Invisibles. There's also a ton of graphic novels that adapt either chamber stories or other King in Yellow mythos itself. The King is also a huge inspiration for Alan Moore's Providence. As a sort of Easter egg, in Stephen King's novel Thinner, the King in Yellow is the name of a head shop that a character purchases something from. Furthermore, in King's short story Grandma, the name of the demonic entity in that story is Hastur. In one of the Doctor Who spin-off novels called The Virgin New Adventures, which is a crazy name for a spin-off novel, a name of one of the great old ones is Hastur the Unspeakable. In George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, which is part of the Game of Thrones universe, on the map there is a city to the east known as Carcosa. And in Carcosa there is said to be a sorcerer lord that lives there known as the Yellow Emperor. This is just Easter eggs in other media. There are dozens of short stories that have taken characters from it or adapted the King in Yellow itself into different versions. There's one by Brian King called The King in Yellow. And it's set in the modern age and is about a couple who goes to witness the King in Yellow play as it's being performed, but all of the characters within the play look like famous deceased musicians. So the people on stage look like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, with the King himself being Elvis. But the King in Yellow influence doesn't just stop at graphic novels and short stories. It's made its way into music as well. The King in Yellow is the name of the 9th album from the band The Dead Milkmen. There's a deathcore band out of Canada called Carcosa. And there are a ton of different artists that have Carcosa as the name of a song or make reference to it in their lyrics. One place where the King in Yellow shows up a ton is video games. In Mass Effect 3, there's a planet called Carcosa. In Dark Souls, there's a boss called Xanthos King Jeremiah or Yellow King Jeremiah. In the first edition of the Dungeons & Dragons Advanced books, one of the deities is named Hastur. I know Dungeons & Dragons isn't a video game, but tabletop game, whatever. The video game Signalis has a ton of references to the King in Yellow, not only directly mentioning it by name as well as Hastur, but incorporating a lot of the themes from the story into the game's lore. My first encounter with the King in Yellow came when I was like 13 or 14 years old, reading SCP entries. Within the SCP Foundation, SCP-701, also known as the Hanged King, is a forbidden play that if anyone acts it out, it summons the Hanged King and causes everyone to, go crazy and kill each other. And I didn't even know that was based off the Yellow King until like a decade later. There are so many more adaptations that incorporate the King in Yellow I could go into, but I guarantee you've heard of at least one of those things. And what's so interesting about that to me is that the story doesn't even exist. Like, yes, obviously Chambers' book exists, but no one's referencing characters from the story like Hildred Castaigne or Alec or Boris. They're all referencing characters from the play that is forbidden to mention. And in all the adaptations that have come since, except of course the people that adapt or make new versions of the play The King in Yellow, in every version that's come since, they are still referencing a forbidden story that we've never heard. Just as in Chambers' book, The King in Yellow is a story kept at the fringes of society that bleeds its way into the stories that are created, in the real world, this same story is bleeding into ours, and that story never existed. And especially considering Chambers took the name from Ambrose, and it's even argued that maybe Ambrose got the idea for names like Carcosa from other stories and poetry that he read, then you could look at it in a meta way and say perhaps there is some forgotten tale out there of this King in Yellow that is influencing our world and art from the shadows. And if you want to say the King in Yellow is just the personification of death, disease, and evil, well, we've certainly got a lot of that. It's as if so much of the culture around us is committed to the verse that the King in Yellow is important, but should never be spoken. But there is one piece of media that adapts The King in Yellow in a way, at least to my knowledge, nothing else has. Not only does it mention a lot of the characters and ideas from Chambers' original stories, but in my opinion, it embodies the themes and terror of Chambers' book as well. And that piece of media is, of course, True Detective. If you haven't seen season 1 of True Detective, I'm going to spoil parts of it now. But as a short review, True Detective season 1 is probably the greatest season of television I've ever seen. It is about two detectives played by Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson as they investigate a string of murders in southern Louisiana. They eventually find that the murders are connected to a cult that has committed conspiracies to kidnap children and perform ritual sacrifices, both human and animal. As they investigate, they find that these murders are a part of a grand conspiracy involving criminals, politicians, church leaders, all involved with a cult that ultimately turns out to be the worshippers of the King in Yellow. Now, there are so many things True Detective does right. I could talk for hours about that season of television. From the writing, to the characters, to the themes and arcs that are played out through that season. Before this video, I'm going to keep it to just the lore surrounding the King itself. I also want to talk about this season because I think it's interesting to see the ways that stories can be adapted over time, or the way that they can change with new writers and new voices speaking through them. And I think it's so interesting how True Detective takes a lot of the themes Chambers made in 1895 and transports them to the modern day, and how they translate so well. One of the reasons I feel True Detective really gets the King in Yellow is because, similar to a lot of the stories within the anthology, it is not so much a story about the King in Yellow as much as it is another story that the King in Yellow interrupts. Just like how a lot of the short stories we've talked about today, it seemed to be a romance or someone who was looking forward to the rest of their life only to be quickly halted by the King's appearance. Much the same in True Detective, it's a murder investigation that comes across a worship of some ancient forgotten god. As they investigate and interview people who are connected to the cult, we hear the same names like Carcosa and the King show up time and time again.
I'll tell you about the Yellow King.
Talking about she met a king.
I closed my eyes and saw the King in Yellow moving through the forest.
Something about some place called Carcosa and the Yellow King.
You know Carcosa.
The story, however, never loses its footing. It never goes from a detective series into a series about fighting supernatural gods. It is always this investigation that the King in Yellow is in the background of. Similar to a lot of the short stories we had in Chambers' book, it's not a question of if the characters in the story can beat God, if they can destroy the King in Yellow. I mean, the way Chambers frames it, that would be the same as beating death. No, instead, it's a question of if they can overcome the temptation of the King in Yellow, if they can persevere and live their life or see their way through the King's influence. There is no defeating the King, there is simply abstaining from him. And much the same in True Detective, it's always a matter of solving the murders. But where True Detective really hits the mark when it comes to adapting the King in Yellow is the terror of inevitability. Themes from Chambers' book, like the fates or the sureness of death, are constantly looming over the characters' heads. And characters within True Detective, especially our two lead detectives, are examples of that. Particularly Rust Cole, played by Matthew McConaughey. Within Chambers' writings, it's like the King wants people to give into despair, or it wants people to give into temptation. The King has this constant theme that death is inevitable. It's always going to find you in the end. So do what you want and love when you can, because in the end, we all rot. Again, tying into the grander themes of the King representing temptation or despair. And when True Detective starts, Rust Cole is already in the thick of that despair. Rust Cole's young daughter was ran over while she was on a bicycle in Rust's front yard. And in some of the philosophy Rust talks about early on into the show, he fully believes in nihilism. He says that the only honorable thing humanity can do is not reproduce and wait for the end. He is fully committed to the idea that life is meaningless, which, from what it seems, is exactly where the King in Yellow would want him to be. But in spite of that, he constantly contradicts himself. In the same breath, when he's saying life is meaningless and death is a release, he is working around the clock to find and stop a killer. Despite saying he believes in nothing, his actions show that he's a hypocrite. This is contrasted well with his partner Marty, played by Woody Harrelson, who constantly talks about how Rust needs to get it together, how life has value. Marty has a wife and kids and say that that's his reason for continuing on and keeping his moral compass. But in spite of this, Marty constantly cheats on his wife and by the end of the series, loses his family. The two men are standing on opposite sides of an aisle, telling each other that they're actually standing on the other side. It seems that Marty gives in to the temptations. To do what you want, life is fleeting, even if he says otherwise. And Russ believes that things happen for a reason, that there's a reason for a man to have character and push for something better, even if he says otherwise. In True Detective, as we come across people who are members or have had affiliations with this cult, they espouse the same things, the same ideas of the King in Yellow. The idea that life and death are inevitable, that the actions and evils of humanity are predetermined. Their connections to Chambers' story goes even deeper than that. They mention explicitly seeing people who would bring about their death in their dreams. I mean, heck, the cult even mentions having visions of things that are ripped straight from Chambers' book.
I saw you in my dream. You're in Carcosa now. Blackstar.
Foretelling their own end, just as Mr. Scott and Tessie did in The Yellow Sign. Speaking of the Yellow Sign, there is a sign throughout True Detective that the cult uses regularly. And that sign is a spiral. I like the idea of the yellow sign being a spiral because if one of the terrors that the King in Yellow persist is that everything will happen to you and there's nothing you can do to stop it, well, a spiral is a straight line that only has one direction. It is a place you will always end up. And the spiral is a recurring motif for the cult that they leave on their victims throughout the series.
You'll do this again. Time is a flat circle.
It's very apparent throughout True Detective that the King in Yellow, this cult, is something that can't be beat. Honestly, you can watch True Detective and just assume that anything that has to do with the King in Yellow or Carcosa is mumbo jumbo. It can just be a crazy cult that can be equated to devil worshippers or spirit worshippers that don't have any actual power. For example, after Russ comes in contact with the first murder victim who displays the yellow sign or the spiral, to be clear, they never call it the yellow sign in True Detective, but I mean, it's a sign that the followers of the Yellow King use. We can put two and two together. After Russ comes across it, we begin to see these visions he's having of space and eternity. But Russ gives a logical explanation for it. He did a stint undercover and did a lot of heavy drugs and still has drug-related flashbacks from time to time. Sure, the cult espouses this forbidden doctrine and eternity and life that comes after, but we never actually see any of that. However, regardless if you view the cult within the show as being legitimate or not, either way, it's unstoppable. Rust and Marty are two detectives, and they find out that politicians as high up as the governor's office and these massive church rings around Louisiana are all connected to this cult. It is a literalist way to describe an all-encompassing god. It's like going up against the entire government. How could two men do it? And that's one of the reasons I think I like True Detective's take on the King in Yellow so much. Because just like a lot of Chambers stories, in some small way, we get a happy ending. Yes, the world is violent. Yes, there will always be terror and evil, but that doesn't mean you just lay down and die. Actually, funny enough, kind of similar to the theme of In the Court of the Dragon, it is not Christianity itself per se, but a symbol from within Christianity that gives Rust his answer. At the beginning of the show, Rust remarks that he's not religious. And Marty asks why then does he have a crucifix of Jesus Christ in his bedroom? Russ says it's because he is fascinated by the character of Jesus Christ, the story, specifically the idea of allowing your own crucifixion. And effectively, that's a symbol for what Russ does throughout the series. He has all these ideas, these educated opinions of why life means nothing and why he shouldn't do anything to help humanity. But every day he crucifies himself and does good for humanity regardless. Throughout True Detective, we get mention of a place called Carcosa, obviously adapted from Chambers' story. But at the end of Season 1, we find that Carcosa is a literal place where these child murders are taking place. These murders, as well as a lot of the cult practices, are being carried out by a man named Errol Childress. Errol isn't so much depicted as someone who falls for the ideas of the Yellow King, as much as he is a vessel for the king himself. He carries out child sacrifices and brutalities and lives in the rot of these killings. We're not shown him until later in the show, but in the first episode, we get the testimony of a little girl who got away from him. Because his face is burnt up and scarred, the little girl described him as a spaghetti-faced man. And for a long time, Rust and others assumed perhaps it was someone wearing a mask. What would you look at that? A character who brings death into the world on behalf of the King in Yellow, who is described as wearing a mask, maybe even a white pale mask. Where have I heard that before? At the end of the series, Rust and Marty make it to this Carcosa and come across the aftermath of all these sacrifices, eventually making their way to the ritual chamber where they come across what else than an effigy of Bones cloaked in a tattered yellow robe. The sacrifices had been going on since far before their investigation began. The King in Yellow was always waiting for them in Carcosa. And it's upon seeing this that Rust has another one of his visions or hallucinations. Rust and Marty finally kill him, with Rust nearly dying in the process. In the final moments of the show, as Rust gets out of the hospital as he's recovering from his injuries, he tells Marty that in those final moments when he thought he was going to die, he felt like he saw his daughter again. That he didn't know exactly what the afterlife was, but whatever it was, she was there. In spite of Rust's own conviction, in spite of what the King in Yellow told him time and time again, in spite of all of the influence telling him the contrary, the good he did mattered. Yes, they did not take down the entire cult that was composed of politicians and businessmen from across the country, but they did some good. They got rid of this guy who was responsible for who knows how many murders over the decades. The objective was never to kill God or eliminate death and evil forever. Just some of it. In the final moments of the show, Russ says this.
I used to make up stories about the stars. It appears to me that the dark has a lot more territory.
You know, you're looking at it wrong, and once there is only dark. When you ask any lights winning.
On my first watch through of the show, I kind of thought this line was a letdown. Again, I was still taking in all these concepts for the first time and didn't really think about the implication. But for a character who throughout this entire show has talked about philosophy and nihilism in these far out, hard to reach terms, it's fitting that the solution would be something so simple. If the King in Yellow embodies or even employs death and evil that exists in the world, then yeah, you can never stop him. But that doesn't mean that life is meaningless either. Just like in the book and in the show, the key is to resist. No matter how much you want to bake down the human experience to inevitability and death's ultimatum. We've known about that since humanity began, but yet for some reason, we keep on trying. You can't fix the world, but you can make it better. And I think True Detective takes the ideas from Chambers' book and makes them into so much more. Not that those ideas weren't there in Chambers' original story, but I feel like True Detective just fleshes it out to such an ornate degree. And plus, it's fitting that the video ends with that because that was my first exposure to the King in Yellow. Yes, what I said earlier is true. The first time I came across the story was through an SCP entry, but I didn't know that that was the King in Yellow until I watched True Detective, looked up everything regarding the King in Yellow, and then found out that I had incidentally read something related to the King in Yellow a decade before. The King in Yellow is a story that exists at the fringe of our stories and has for a century. And one of my favorite things about that is regardless of how bleak the world is or how powerful the influence of the King in Yellow could be, even though we keep telling the story, we keep telling it with a happy ending. And I don't know what that says about us, but I think that's pretty cool. And I also think you're pretty cool for sticking through this video for as long as you have, and I just want to say thank you for watching. The King in Yellow is so fascinating to me. It's so cool that there's a story that doesn't even exist that has influenced so many other stories. I'm talking about the play itself. Chambers talked about this forbidden play, and then that forbidden play goes on to start other stories that talk about the same forbidden play. It's just such a neat concept that I can't really think of having seen anywhere else. It's such an interesting tale that deserves some more love, and hopefully I've been able to introduce it to at least a few of you, and if I have, that really means something to me, and I appreciate it. So read The King in Yellow, check out Flaw Peacock's video on the other short stories in there if you're interested, and please, for the love of all that's good, watch Season 1 of True Detective. There is some nudity within the show, I might add, so if you're of age and responsible, watch it. But if it's something that sounds interesting to you, I can't recommend it enough. Again, I'm not a qualified guy to talk about literature to any regard. I took 3 literature classes before I dropped out of college, so there's my credentials. I'm just a guy that likes stories and likes talking about it, and I appreciate you all hearing me out. Again, if you'd like to watch these videos on Spotify, the link to the official Spotify channel will be in the description, as well as to Wendigang, where again, in a little over a week, we're going to have our first video over there, and hopefully you enjoy. Y'all have been great, and it means a lot to have you around. That should do it for now, but I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.